many pressing issues, conflicts. There are areas of competition. There are some areas of cooperation as well with China. So it's a very interesting chapter, and we shall cover all the relevant topics for both prelims and mains. But before we start, just an important announcement. Going forward, all the classes will be available recorded on the app. All right, you can watch even some of the previous sessions as well, and these classes will be available recorded in the app as well, so you can watch it later just to revise to help you recollect your thoughts. All right, so let's get started and let's talk about the historical links, the civilizational links between India and China. Because see, both India and China are ancient civilizations. Since ancient times, the Indian civilization and the Chinese civilization both have been thriving. Both were very progressive, very large economies since the ancient times. They had made a lot of advances in society, in administration, in global trade as well. Right? In fact, both were industrialized economies since the very ancient times. So the Indian and Chinese civilization, they have contributed a lot to the overall progress of humanity. And of course, historically, we have been linked. We have historical civilizational links that dates back to at least more than 2,000 years. So just having a basic idea about the historical civilizational links could be very helpful for you, especially for your mains, when you're writing your answers. Even if the question is dealing with contemporary issues, right? Even if it's dealing with today's issues, you can always give it a historical context. When you begin writing your answer, right? Let's say you're talking about India-China border dispute, or let's say your question is on the economic relations between India and China. When you're talking about these present-day issues, if you can begin the answer with a historical context, just a small pointer about India-China relations in the past, that would be a great beginning because you are showing the entire spectrum of the relationship. So let me point out some of the historical connections that point to links between our two ancient civilizations. See, both India and China were linked with the ancient Silk Road or the Silk Route, through which trade and ideological exchange was taking place since centuries. Buddhism has traveled from India to China. Even today, Buddhism is a popular religion in China. India is the birthplace of Buddhism, and there are clear evidences, documented evidences to show that Buddhism traveled from India to China and the rest of Asia as well. Similarly, there are historical records that point towards trade between Indian and Chinese civilization during ancient and later medieval times. There have been several empires in India, especially the Cholas, the Pallavas, and a few others, who had trade links and very strong diplomatic links several centuries ago with the Chinese empires. Of course, the Indian state did not exist. The Chinese state as it is today did not exist. You had these various empires and kingdoms, but the civilizational connect was definitely there. Even in our historical texts, in a text such as Mahabharata, in Kautilya's Arthashastra, there are references pointing towards the Chinese civilization, which indicates links between the Indian and the Chinese civilization. Across the Himalayas, beyond Tibet, right, there have been references pointing towards the Chinese civilization and its links with India. All right. Then if you look at Nalanda University in today's Bihar, Nalanda was one of the world's oldest universities. It played a critical role in spreading Buddhism. Nalanda was so popular back in those days that students from across Asia would come to India to study at Nalanda. It was a major learning center, especially with regard to Buddhist and spiritual studies. Students from as far as South Korea, today's China, today's Vietnam, right, from across Southeast and East Asia have come to Nalanda to study, and thus pointing to close people-to-people relations back in those days. In this regard, the role of Tamil dynasties is particularly important, especially the Cholas. The Cholas played a pivotal role in the Indian subcontinent in establishing influence across Southeast Asia, stretching all the way till China and across the Indian Ocean region. The Cholas were a predominant power, right? They were predominantly a naval power. They had established their naval supremacy all across the Indian Ocean, stretching from Maldives to Sri Lanka, going all the way till Singapore and Indonesia. These entire waters were dominated by the Cholas at one point of time, and they had clearly extended their military, economic, and cultural influence across Southeast Asia, stretching up till China and across the Indian Ocean region. Now, this is quite phenomenal, considering the time, the era, the technology of those days. The Cholas had achieved something spectacular. Now, see, even today, if you go to, let's say, Singapore, if you go to Bali in Indonesia, if you go to Thailand or Cambodia or Vietnam, you find very close Indian links, right? You can't ignore those connections, be it in food, in the festivals that are celebrated, in the faith which is practiced in Southeast Asia and India, right? And also the names of some places, right? And there are several monuments as well, several archaeological records, which clearly link these regions with the Indian civilization. Now, if you go to, let's say, Malaysia or Vietnam today, or Cambodia or Bali, you find very clear references which highlight the ancient and medieval Indian links, right? And the Cholas, particularly the Tamil dynasties, were specifically very important in spreading this influence across the Indian Ocean and across Southeast Asia. Is that clear? So, heritage and culture related to Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism has traveled from India towards these regions. There were several Muslim traders and merchants who formed a common link between West Asia, India, and Southeast Asia. This was many centuries ago. There were several Hindu kingdoms forming a link, extending their influence. Like I said, the Cholas were predominantly a naval power. They fought wars across this region. Near Indonesia, today's Indonesia, we had the Srivijaya Empire, which was defeated by the Cholas. They had fought a legendary maritime battle. A naval battle was fought around today's Indonesia, and the Srivijaya Empire, which dominated Indonesia, was defeated by the Cholas. The Malacca Strait was historically vital even in those days, and the Cholas dominated the Malacca Strait, which was a choke point, an important trading point. Today, Singapore was playing a key role in maritime trade back in those days as well. And the Cholas didn't stop here. They expanded their influence further towards South China Sea, and there are very well documented links between the Cholas and the Song dynasty of China. The Song dynasty was one major empire in China, and it had very good relations with the Cholas. They actually had very good relations. They had maritime trade relations. There has been an exchange of goods between the two sides. From India, a lot of precious commodities were exported, including spices and gold, etc. From China, right, a lot of goods have been imported as well since the ancient medieval times, from silk to paper to fishing techniques. So there has been a lot of exchange of ideas, exchange of trade between the two sides. And the Cholas and the Song dynasty didn't stop here. They even had naval cooperation between them. They were actually tackling piracy together near the Malacca Strait. Back in those days, the Malacca Strait had become a hub of pirates. is that in and around today's Singapore, piracy was a major threat. They would attack the ships carrying goods, precious goods. So countering piracy became a joint objective of the Cholas and the Song dynasty. They would jointly patrol the waters, work together. They would even share shipbuilding technology, naval technology. They would work with each other to share shipbuilding technology as well. There are documented evidences to link the Cholas with the Song dynasty. Now, this is quite similar to modern day relations. This is exactly the kind of relations, diplomatic relations that we have today with several friendly countries. Today, we jointly tackle piracy near Horn of Africa. Right? We'll work with Japan, we'll work with US, with European countries. Our navies are deployed near Horn of Africa to tackle piracy. We have naval cooperation with several friendly countries. Right? We have active maritime trade with several important partners. So in many ways, similar relations existed between the Indian and the Chinese civilization since many centuries. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this is because it will not only give you that historical perspective, it will also help you understand that it is possible for India and China to be friends, at least to be partners. See, today the atmosphere has changed completely. In the last 70 years, or specifically in the last 60, 65 years, both the sides have developed a very negative perception of each other. India has a very limited and poor understanding of China. Similarly, the Chinese have a very poor understanding of India. Right? For us, China has become enemy number one, an aggressive power which is threatening our integrity and sovereignty, which is not hesitating to use force against us. Right? So there's obviously a negative image associated with China as far as India is concerned. Similarly, the Chinese have a very poor understanding of what is India. They look at India as some third world country which is very backward. Right? There is that discrimination that comes in from China. They have a very poor understanding of Indian culture, the Indian economy. In general, when you talk about the masses, the common people, right? On both sides, we have a very poor understanding of each other. It is this lack of our historical civilizational links which leads to this ignorance. Is that clear? And this actually plays a role in today's relations. The lack of awareness, the lack of respect towards each other, the lack of understanding of the historical links makes us treat each other as if we are hostile to each other, as if we are enemies of each other. All right? So what I'm trying to say is that today the relations can be much better. It need not be as hostile as it is today. Yes, of course, China is an aggressive power. There's no doubt about it. It's an expansionist power, an aggressive power which does not hesitate to use force. All right? In fact, using force has become the first option for China of late. India, on its part, has its own genuine concerns, but still doesn't mean we should remain hostile to each other. There are many areas where we can still work together, where we can cooperate. And as former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh stated once, the world is large enough to accommodate both India and China. Both India and China can grow, can thrive together. We need not be against each other. This is a lesson we can learn from history. Right? Those who don't learn lessons from history are bound to commit mistakes again and again. Our history offers us a very vital lesson, a key lesson for today's relations. Two major empires back in those days, mistakes again and again. On its part, has its own genuine concerns, but still doesn't mean we should remain hostile to each other. There are many areas where we can still work together, where we can cooperate. And as former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh stated once, the world is large enough to accommodate both India and China. Both India and China can grow, can thrive together. We need not be against each other. This is a lesson we can learn from history. Right? Those who don't learn lessons from history are bound to commit mistakes again and again. Our history offers us a very vital lesson, a key lesson for today's relations. Two major empires back in those days, they were cooperating, working together. They actually had a good relationship. Right? You find that presence in both the countries. Today, the lack of trust in each other stems from the fact that we have a very poor, limited understanding of each other. Former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, before 2010, around 2009, he made a very important statement. He said that both India and China are rising powers, both are obviously bound to run into conflicts. But however, the world is so large enough, there's enough space in the world, which will allow India and China to grow parallelly. We need not fight each other, we need not compete, we need not be in conflict. We can parallelly rise together, either remaining neutral or by collaborating with each other. So this understanding is very, very essential to shape the relations of today. But right now, the atmosphere has changed completely. Right? And of course, China takes most of the blame for it. Since 1950s till date, China has created multiple problems, multiple challenges. And it has consistently remained an aggressive power, which has often threatened our integrity and sovereignty. So let's understand the root of this conflict. Let's understand the border dispute specifically, because that is the most important topic according to me under India-China relationship. Is that clear? Under this chapter, see, it's a very big chapter. Under this chapter, according to me, there are three important topics. One is the border dispute. All right. Second is the economic relations between the two. And third, the areas of cooperation and areas of conflict. There are some areas where we cooperate with each other. Even today, when we have the worst of relations, even then we still work with each other in certain areas. But there are certain areas where we are opposed to each other, where we have different viewpoints. So these three broad topics, according to me, are the most important, especially for your mains. All right, so in today's session, I'll try to do justice to all these topics. Let's take a look at the border dispute first. It is a defining aspect of the relationship because we have even fought a war in 1962, and it has left a lasting impact. Recently, in the last 13 to 15 years, the border tensions have escalated again. There have been multiple incursions, which have been going on from 2009 to 2010. There have been major escalations like the Doklam dispute, which we studied under India-Bhutan. There have been recent clashes at Ladakh, and our military standoff continues even today as we speak. Is that clear? So that is something we need to understand in complete detail. So this requires you to understand why China is such an aggressive power. That's the first question which comes to mind. Today, most experts, most analysts, and even several Indian diplomats, they believe that China has been an aggressive power. It has become an aggressive power. It has always had expansionist tendencies, meaning it wants to expand its territory. It has had territorial ambitions right from the beginning. China is known to exert itself, push itself on others. China behaves in such a way that as if it's a bully. It bullies others. It reacts very aggressively against others, even against small countries. This has become China's nature. Right? When I say China's nature, I'm referring to PRC, the People's Republic of China, and the Communist Party of China, which rules the country, which forms the state, the government of China. So to understand why China behaves so aggressively, we need to look at history again. We need to look at the history of PRC. Where did the PRC come from? What's the history of the Communist Party in China? Unless and until you understand the ideology and motivations of the Communist Party of China, you cannot understand why China is so aggressive today. Is that clear? The PRC, the current Chinese state, the People's Republic of China, was established by 1949. By 1949, state, the People's Republic of China, was established by 1949. By 1949, the PRC had established itself as a new country. So before this, what was the status here? Before PRC formed the government, right, before we saw the establishment of the current Chinese state, China was ruled by a government called the Republic of China. The Republic of China was actually a much smaller territory. All right, China didn't even share borders with India at that point. All right, this is very important to understand. China was a relatively smaller country before 1949. It didn't even have borders with India. Is that clear? China was not even a Himalayan state or Himalayan power at that point of time. If you look at early 1900s or late 1800s, right? So China was not a neighbor of India at that point because Tibet was our neighbor. It was Tibet, the kingdom of Tibet, which shared the borders all the way from Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh, going all the way till Arunachal Pradesh. So even Nepal, Bhutan, and British India, their boundaries was with Tibet, the kingdom of Tibet, not with China. The Republic of China was a much smaller country, cornered in East Asia, but this government was considered as corrupt. It was considered as an elitist government. It was a rule of the elites, the rich, powerful, the politically influential. They were thriving, whereas the masses were left behind. The farmers, the peasants, the poor workers, indigenous groups, they were left behind, neglected. So in modern day Republic of China, that is, let's say by early 1900s, there were massive problems, massive economic and social problems in the country. There was extreme poverty, a huge income divide and a social divide. While the elitist population was enjoying all the benefits, the masses were suffering immensely. There was a massive divide within the country. Plus, China had lost its traditional influence. The Republic of China was nowhere close to the glory of the Chinese Empire. At one point, the Chinese Empire during ancient medieval times was a very dominant empire. From the South China Sea towards Central Asia, towards Tibet, right, stretching till Afghanistan, Iran. This whole area was at one point dominated by then Chinese empires. For example, the Song Dynasty was a very powerful empire with a vast territorial extent. This ancient glory had been lost. China at one point dominated the economy, just like the Indian civilization. But this had been lost in the medieval and modern times. And the government of Republic of China didn't bother about restoring the culture, the pride, the economy of the Chinese state. So in general, there was a feeling amongst the people of China that the state had failed. It had failed in delivering governance. It had failed in looking after its people, right? It had failed to address the divide, the social and economic divide. And more importantly, it had failed to restore the glory of the Chinese empire. China had been left exploited by several outside powers, quite similar to India. This is what had contributed to the decline of the Chinese pride and Chinese identity. Just like India was exploited by outside colonial powers. Quite similarly, the British and the French, they had looted China of its wealth. They had hurt Chinese pride, identity and pride. And along with this, Imperial Japan had committed a lot of atrocities against the Chinese. You would have read about the Opium Wars, right? When you read about world history, you will read about the Opium Wars involving European colonial powers like Britain and France and how they dominated these markets in China. See, China was never colonized like India. In India, for example, European powers including Britain, the British, the French, the Dutch, right, the Portuguese, they would permanently colonize the Indian cities like India. And along with this, Imperial Japan had committed a lot of atrocities against the Chinese. You would have read about the Opium Wars, right? When you read about world history, you will read about the Opium Wars involving European colonial powers like Britain and France and how they dominated these markets in China. See, China was never colonized like India. In India, for example, European powers including Britain, the British, the French, the Dutch, right, the Portuguese, they would permanently colonize the Indian subcontinent. This never happened with China, right? The permanent colonization was resisted, but the economic destruction was carried out by European colonial powers. This was during the medieval times. And Imperial Japan at one point was a brutal power. Imperial Japan has a very bad history behind it. Even till the Second World War, right, from 1800s to Second World War, Imperial Japan was known to commit massive atrocities. Even today, the Japanese are hated across Asia. I'm not even kidding. If you go to, let's say, South Korea or Vietnam, or if you go to China, you will see that the people have a historical dislike towards the Japanese. Today, Japan is transformed. Today, the Japan is very, very different. From 1945, the Japan that has developed is very different. It's apologetic of what has happened in the past. Today's Japanese are apologetic for what their ancestors have done to the world. They have done unspeakable atrocities in Asia, and the Chinese were at the receiving end. During medieval and modern times, Imperial Japan committed mass slaughters, genocides in China, in Korean Peninsula, in Southeast Asia. It was such a brutal power, which obviously laid the foundation for Japan to become a fascist imperial state. So as a result, the Chinese pride, Chinese identity had been hurt due to this constant outside exploitation. And the rulers, those who were in power, had done nothing to protect this Chinese identity. At least this was the perception of the masses. This is what the people believed. That the Republic of China does not care about the people, their identity, their history, their glory. And this sentiment, this resentment always existed in China. This was building up by 1930s. This resentment was building up by 1930s. And right around this time, in 1921, 1922, the Communist Party of China was established. Under the Republic of China, there was a lot of resentment amongst the masses which had built up due to economic failure, due to the historical difficulties the Chinese had faced. So the masses in general, they hated the Chinese state itself. They held the leaders, the government responsible for all the problems. So at this point, the Communist Party of China was established. Communism was gaining popularity around the world, right? As a political, economic ideology, communism and socialism were gaining popularity around the world. So the Communist Party of China was established, and within a few years, by 1930s, a leader came up called Mao Zedong to lead the Communist Party. Mao Zedong, the founding father of today's China, the PRC, he would emerge as the leader, the general secretary of the Communist Party, and he would lay the foundation for a left-wing extremist ideology to transform the Chinese state and the Chinese civilization. Mao Zedong, who was a philosopher, thinker, right? He would believe in a radical extremist ideology. He would firmly believe that any such state which commits atrocities should be thrown out. The masses who are suffering, they shouldn't take the suffering anymore. They should unite. They should unite to take up arms against the state and fight an insurgent war, to fight a people-led war, to throw such governments out and capture state power. This is the philosophy of Maoism. This is the core philosophy. I'm just giving you the basic idea here. In internal security, we have a dedicated chapter for left-wing extremism, where we will specifically study about Maoism, or also called as Naxalism in India. So the Maoist ideology is something we'll study in detail under internal security. But for the time being, for the purposes of international relations, you should just know what is Maoist ideology. How did this contribute to the rise of the modern Chinese state? And how is it linked with today's problems between India and China? So just know that when the masses were suffering, when there was resentment, when there was such a huge divide in China, the Communist Party led by Mao Zedong established a very popular ideology, a left-wing extremist ideology called Maoism. This was the brainchild of Mao Zedong. He writes in his books, such as Guerrilla Warfare, for example. It's one of the popular books by Mao Zedong. He writes that atrocity should not be tolerated. The people who are suffering, who are the victims, they should rebel. They should fight back. They should unite and take up arms, take up weapons against the state, challenge the state's authority, fight a war, a mass people-led war, and throw such governments out to capture state power. Now, as you can see here, this ideology is inherently violent. It is an inherently extremist, violent ideology, and it has no place in a modern democracy, in a civilized society. So inherently, this communist ideology, this left-wing, this strand of left-wing extremism is extremist, it's radical, and it preaches violence. Violence is the only option in Maoism. In Maoist philosophy, the only option for the masses, for a farmer who has been neglected, for peasants and workers who have been oppressed and targeted, according to Mao Zedong, the only option they have is to join the Maoists, take up arms, and take up violence against the state. Such a radical extremist ideology has no place in a modern civilized society. Yes, the suffering of the masses is understandable, their pain is understandable, you can empathize with it. But you can't accept the fact that taking up violence is the only option in today's world. That is unacceptable in a modern civilized state. This is what Maoism believes in, this is what Maoism propagates, and this is how the PRC was established. Maoism became widely popular in China, it capitalized on the resentment. Mao Zedong laid out the strategies, the tactics that should be followed to win this war. He would give out the specific details as well as to how the people should organize, how they should rebel, how they should make use of the jungles, the forests, the geography to hide and target the state, how they should arrange weapons, what kind of warfare tactics should they use, how should they specialize in jungle warfare or guerrilla warfare. All such strategies were laid out by Mao Zedong himself. This would motivate the masses, triggering a massive rebellion, which led to the Chinese Civil War that lasted for several years between 1930s to 1940s. Is that clear? This is the Chinese Civil War, a people's rebellion led by the Maoists, led by the Communist Party, which was fighting a war against the Chinese state, that is the Republic of China. And eventually in this war, the Maoists, they won. They defeated the Republic of China. The Republic of China was thrown out. It was cornered to the small island of Taiwan. And this is the origin of the China-Taiwan conflict as well. Today, I'm sure many of you know that China claims sovereignty over Taiwan. China sees Taiwan as its own territory. Right? Taiwan is not recognized as a country by most of the other countries. It's because of this. The then Chinese government, the Republic of China, was thrown out from mainland China. It was cornered into the small island in East China Sea called Taiwan. Right? So this is where the then Chinese state exists. The then Chinese state was pushed out, thrown out by the Maoist war, and it's been cornered to Taiwan. Since then, Taiwan adopted democracy to the support of US especially, right, and has been claiming independence. But China does not recognize this. It even says it's going to occupy Taiwan entirely, and it has made every other country recognize Taiwan as Chinese territory. All right, so it leads to the present China-Taiwan conflict. It has its roots here in the Chinese Civil War. The Civil War was won by the Communist Party. The Maoists won the Civil War. They threw the government out, and the then pro-government supporters, they ran to Taiwan and sheltered themselves in Taiwan. All right. So as the communists won the war, they formed a new Chinese state, a communist state called PRC. That is how the People's Republic of China was established. It's a new country formed by 1949. Now see, there are two ways of looking at this. One, you can empathize with the Chinese people. Their suffering, it was genuine, right? The resentment is understandable, right? India also had gone through something similar. India had struggled with the colonial rule. Our economy, our culture, everything had been destroyed by the colonial rulers. When India gained independence eventually, right? We were facing massive challenges, quite similar to China. So in many ways, our story, the Chinese story, was similar, at least in some ways. We could understand, we could empathize with that. That's one reason why India was a supporter of China at one point. See, many have a very short-sighted view that India was blindly supporting China from the beginning. That's not the case. This is about a shared ideology. Back in 1940s, the sentiment was that across Asia, Africa, these countries have to unite. The former colonies have to unite because the European colonialists had exploited us. They destroyed the world, destroyed the economy, destroyed our culture. There was a natural sentiment from, let's say, India towards African countries, from India towards other Asian countries, because we all had been exploited. We all had a similar story of suffering. So India naturally empathized with China. We even backed the Chinese Civil War, as in we expressed sentiments, because in many ways we rebelled as well. Right? India's freedom struggle was largely peaceful, very different from what China saw. But still, we could understand why it was happening, and there was a sentiment of support from India towards China. All right. So that is what laid the foundation for a friendly relationship in the beginning years. When the Civil War was won by the Communist Party, right, the Indian government under Prime Minister Nehru recognized China and sought out friendly relations with China because we had a common connect. We had a common connect. We both had fought against exploitation, gained independence, and formed new states. But of course, the ideologies were very different. India's freedom struggle was largely non-violent, right? But the Chinese Civil War was entirely extremist. It was not even revolutionary. It was extremist. But India chose to empathize with China, considering the historical suffering of the Chinese people, which was quite similar to the suffering of the Indian people. This is what we connected with, not with the extremist ideology of China. So India began this relationship on a right note. And in fact, even China reached out to India on a friendly note. So in 1949, 1950, we did lay the foundation for a close relationship. It's not that we were concerned about China, we were worried about China. China didn't have any problems with India initially. So in that initial 1 year, from 1949 to 1950, we actually reached out to each other, we had a decent relationship. But however, the important point you should take away from this is the fact that the core of China today is rooted in extremist violence, in being aggressive. Because see, today's PRC is a communist authoritarian state. Even today, the PRC is influenced in being aggressive. Because see, today's PRC. So India began this relationship on a light note. And in fact, even China reached out to India on a friendly note. So in 1949, 1950, we did lay the foundation for a close relationship. It's not that we were concerned about China, we were worried about China. China didn't have any problems with India initially. So in that initial 1 year, from 1949 to 1950, we actually reached out to each other, we had a decent relationship. But however, the important point you should take away from this is the fact that the core of China today is rooted in extremist violence, in being aggressive. Because see, today's PRC is a communist authoritarian state. Even today, the PRC is influenced by the Maoist ideals. It's a country, it's a state which was formed on the basis of an extremist ideology. And this is the root of Chinese aggression. The Communist Party and Mao Zedong, they propagated that China will thrive, it will survive, and it will fight any outside exploitation only when it is aggressive. This is an ideology which has been propagated during the Civil War and after PRC was formed as well. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party would keep insisting that we should restore the Chinese glory, restore the vast territory of the Chinese empire which existed in ancient medieval times, restore the pride of the Chinese people, fight against all outsiders. It is this philosophy that PRC believes in, which makes China an aggressive expansionist power today. That's why as soon as PRC was formed, the first priority of the PRC was to expand its territory. All right, PRC was actually a smaller country. It didn't even have borders with India. Please remember, when PRC was formed, China did not have borders with India. PRC was a much smaller country in East Asia. But PRC became an expansionist aggressive power because of this ideology, the radical aggressive ideology, which preaches violence. Violence comes inherently to the PRC because it was founded through violence, it was established through violence. This is a fundamental difference between India and China. India was established through a non-violent struggle, whereas China was established through an aggressive extremist ideology, violent ideology. So the PRC wanted to restore that glory, to undo the mistakes of its former government, the Republic of China, to fight against outsiders because there was a hesitance against any outside exploitation. So that is why China became an insecure country, a very insecure power. This is not just my opinion. Many experts, they have the same analysis. They agree that China today is actually an insecure power, right? This insecurity of China comes from its exploitation, which China has faced in the past. It comes from the Maoist ideology. It comes from the Chinese Civil War, right? A belief has taken root that if you don't fight aggressively, if you don't react aggressively, outsiders will take you for granted, all right? Usually those who are insecure, they are the ones who react violently. For example, let's say even at a human level, if you look at bullies, right, especially at a younger age, there will be those who will be bullying others, threatening others, targeting others, beating up other kids. These bullies are inherently insecure and they express their insecurity to shield themselves through violence, through aggression. This is a well-established psychological principle. And something similar is seen with the Chinese state, the PRC. There is the degree of insecurity that someone will snatch everything away from China. Someone will destroy China. Someone will exploit China. This stems from the historical exploitation, right? And this pushes China to take up extremism, take up violence, take up aggression as the first option. This is not excusable, right? This cannot be justified, especially not in today's world. But I'm trying to help you understand where the Chinese aggression comes from. It is rooted in insecurity. It is rooted in the extremist violent ideology of the Communist Party, right? The Maoist doctrine has a direct role to play here. It has taught the Chinese state to remain aggressive, to expand the territory, capture new territories, so that it becomes a large power, vast power, so that no outsider can ever threaten China. All right, so that has been the foundational philosophy of China, the PRC, and this is what leads to today's problems as well. That's why immediately after establishing itself, guess what China did? It displayed its expansionist behavior by annexing Tibet and Xinjiang. Two large regions were occupied by force. China occupied the kingdom of Tibet, which was a Buddhist kingdom, right? It occupied Tibet by force in 1950 and expanded towards Central Asia by capturing Xinjiang. Both the regions were dominated by people of different faith, different ethnicity. Is that clear? See, Tibet has always been a Buddhist-dominated region. Xinjiang, which has more close links with Central Asia, has always been a Muslim region dominated by a native community called the Uyghur Muslims. The Uyghur Muslims are the natives of Xinjiang, whereas the Buddhists, with links with India, Nepal, Bhutan, right from the Himalayan belt, they dominated the Tibet region. These regions were forcefully annexed and occupied by China, by the PRC, as a part of its expansionism. This was the aggressive rise of China. Is that clear? Do you guys know which is the majority community in China? Does anyone know which is the majority group in China? If you look at Chinese society today, which race or which ethnicity is the majority? Good. A couple of them have got it right. Prabhat and Ashutosh, they've got the right answer. Very good. Even Ravi Shankar and Tarun and Vaishnavi. Good. It's the Han community. The Hans are the ethnic majority. Majority of the Chinese, they belong to the Han ethnic race. So be it with other ethnic groups, other racial groups, religious groups, the Hans have always had issues with them. Most of the Hans will be atheist because of the communist Maoist inclination. Right? Extreme communism believes in atheism. There is no scope for religious beliefs in extreme communism. However, many Hans are Christians as well. There are many who are Buddhists as well. All right, but majority of them happen to be atheists, and atheists are the majority, which leads them to often target the minorities, not just minority religions, even other minority ethnic groups and races. So China expanded very quickly in 1950 by capturing Tibet and parts of Xinjiang and expanded its territory, and overnight it became a neighbor of India. Overnight, PRC became a Himalayan state. It wasn't a Himalayan state, but it became a Himalayan state by capturing territory. This began the aggressive rise of China. The expansionist behavior was very clear, and as we have studied in previous classes, this caused alarm for India, for Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan. All these countries were concerned. They were worried. If the large Tibetan kingdom could be occupied by China with force, then China could possibly do the same against other Himalayan states. That is why Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan, they sought India's help. They sought India's protection. That's why they signed the treaties, asked for India to defend them. Right? India was a larger power here. Now, India started doubting the Chinese intentions. As we saw the expansionist behavior of China, the then Nehru government became very cautious. India reacted to this incident, and we criticized the annexation of Tibet. We opposed the annexation of Tibet. We expressed sympathy with the Tibetan people, with the Buddhists, and we urged China to not resort to extremism, to not resort to such violence. All right? So when India expressed its opinion on the Tibetan annexation, it angered China. China and the leaders of the Communist Party were angry that India was interfering in its internal affairs. This is how they perceived it. They perceived it as India's internal interference in Chinese internal matters. According to PRC, Tibet was always part of China. Based on these historical claims, they occupied the kingdom of Tibet, which had been independent for several centuries actually. Right? The PRC occupied the region, started violating the human rights of the people, started targeting the Buddhists. Similarly, Uyghur Muslims were targeted after capturing the whole of Xinjiang. So when India expressed concern about these developments, China presumed that India is turning hostile. India is interfering in internal matters of the country. And also don't forget, this was the Cold War period. The Cold War had just begun between democracies and communist states. China was a communist state. India was a democracy. Even though India was non-aligned, right? We never chose between US and Soviet Union. But in the eyes of China, India was a democracy, so it assumed that we are naturally aligned with Western countries. China would always remain under the assumption that India is with US, UK, and European countries because India is a democracy, right? These ideological differences and the poor understanding of each other is what triggered the mutual suspicion and distrust of each other. Initially, we both reached out to each other. We actually started out on a friendly note. We recognized the PRC when it won the war. We set up friendly relations as well. We even backed China at the United Nations, right, to get the permanent seat. This is when many argue that India would have been given the permanent seat if not for China, right? There's a criticism against the Nehru government that we gave up the UN seat. That is exactly not what happened. At that point, when UN was giving geographical representation for different regions, only one seat was given to whole of Asia. And the global opinion was that Asia could be represented only by a large country like China. At that point, China was the largest power compared to even India, right? And also, across Asia, China had more acceptance, right? Across Southeast Asia, East Asia, China had more acceptance. So keeping the interest of the whole Asia region in mind, it was China which was a legitimate candidate, not India at that point. We supported the candidature, yes. When the voting came up, we did support China. We did play a role in helping China, but doesn't mean India could have become the permanent member. That opportunity didn't really exist. Yes, discussions did happen. There were suggestions that India could be offered. Similar suggestions were there that Japan could be offered, Korea could be offered, right? But these were simply discussions which were happening. But the large opinion at the UN was in favor of China. We went with that. We supported that opinion because across Asia, China was one country which had that acceptance. All right. So initially, even though we had reached out in a friendly manner, China reacted aggressively. It was China which made the first mistake. It reacted aggressively when it occupied Tibet and Xinjiang. We expressed genuine concern and it mistook India's intentions. It perceived this as India's interference in its internal matters, and it saw India as a democratic country which is ideologically opposed to a communist authoritarian country. Right? Obviously, between our polity, between our societies, there was a fundamental difference. China was a closed country, an authoritarian dictatorship, whereas India was a fledgling democracy with basic fundamental rights where the government is bound to protect the rights. This basic difference and the lack of understanding of each other is what created the suspicion and the distrust. And it was not honestly India's mistake, it was the Chinese mistake which was made. It was China which showed the aggression, carried out violent expansionism, and threatened India as well, and saw this as India's interference when we expressed concern. So this began a series of mistakes by both the sides. Right? The Nehru government would want to commit a series of mistakes, and China would commit a primary set of mistakes, which would lead to a series of escalatory events throughout 1950s, which culminated in the 1962 war. I'm essentially laying the foundation for the 62 war and to understand the border dispute. For that, you should know the key developments that happened in 1950s. Now that you know the history of PRC, now that you know why China is aggressive, why it always behaves violently, now let's see what happened after the annexation of Tibet. When Tibet was annexed, of course, China faced resistance from the US. All right. Also understand this from a global perspective, not just the India-China perspective. US saw that a communist power was rising. Naturally, it would be aligned with the Soviet Union, right? So US and Western countries, they started boycotting China, especially after it started committing atrocities against the Tibetan Buddhists. US cut off its relations, its diplomatic relations with China, and it was seen as an ally of the Soviet Union. It was firmly on the Soviet side. It was part of the Soviet power bloc. So the Cold War clearly divided the Western countries and China as well. This had an impact on India-China relations as well. All right, I'll touch upon this as we proceed to our discussion. We will discuss the role of India, China, and the Western countries. How does this equation work? Where does India stand? What Western countries have done? What does it do to China? How does China react against India and the Western countries? That is something we should understand from 1950s till now. And I'll touch upon this topic as we proceed to the chapter. Now see, by 1950, suspicion had started, mistrust had started. The Nehru government couldn't trust China anymore because India was taken aback when China reacted so violently. Right? Even many countries, even Mongolia, even then Soviet Union, even Vietnam, they all had their concerns about what China was doing. Soviet Union, which was China's close ally. Even today, Russia has concerns about China. Even though Russia, China are close friends and allies, Russia always has a certain degree of doubt about what China can do next. China is so unpredictable. It is very reactive. It reacts to situations. Sometimes it overreacts. And using force, using aggression comes naturally to the PRC because of its ideology, because of its Maoist communist ideology. This concerns even Russia as well, and Soviet Union also was concerned about it. That's why Russia, China are not extremely good friends. They do have their own concerns about each other. But because of their common interests, they're aligned with each other. So India, obviously, being a democratic state, open society, we had our concerns about China. We started mistrusting, we started doubting the Chinese intentions. Similarly, PRC started doubting India. It saw India as a proxy of the West, as a democratic country aligned with Western countries. So this divide was firmly established. So to address this, to resolve this mutual suspicion and distrust of each other, India reached out to China, and China also responded. And we signed a historical agreement called the Panchsheel Agreement. Remember, I mentioned this while talking about the Gujarat Doctrine under India-Pakistan. The Panchsheel principles, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, was brought out between India and China as a peaceful gesture. And this was a collaborative initiative, a joint initiative. All right? India and China both tried to settle the difference, peaceful gesture. And this was a collaborative initiative, a joint initiative. All right? India and China both tried to settle the differences. They tried to address the suspicion. They tried to build trust. And they brought 5 principles, the core principles from Buddhism. Panchsheel is rooted in Buddhist philosophy. Is that clear? These 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, they are actually commandments to a Buddhist monk. In Buddhism, it has been prescribed that this is how a Buddhist monk should live. All right, these 5 principles should be followed by a Buddhist monk to lead a peaceful life, to coexist peacefully with other human beings and with nature. So this is a philosophical ideology in Buddhism, and we brought this to diplomacy. Since Buddhism was a common link between India and China, We both relied on this philosophical principles and we brought it out as a doctrine and made it the foundation of India-China relationship. So both Prime Minister Nehru and the then Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, they both reached out to each other. They tried to resolve their differences, tried to reassure each other, and in a very friendly manner, we actually signed this agreement, the Panchsheel Agreement. An attempt was made to repair the damage, to repair the relationship, and 5 principles were laid down to define India-China relations. All right. So basically, under these principles, they would show mutual respect to each other's integrity and sovereignty. They would commit to not use aggression against each other. Mutual non-aggression was taken as a commitment to not use force against the other. Non-interference in each other's internal affairs, will not meddle with the internal issue of the other country. Treating each other as equal partners and cooperating with each other for mutual benefit, and coexisting peacefully side by side. Two large Asian powers would coexist. We wouldn't fight each other. Rather, we will coexist. We will help each other. We will respect each other's territorial boundaries. We will commit to non-aggression, not meddle in the internal matters, and treat each other as equal partners, so that we can both coexist and thrive together in Asia. This was the philosophy that was adopted as the foundation of India-China relations. In fact, Panchsheel became a very popular doctrine because this was a very new ideology that we had championed. See, the world of 1950s was divided between the Soviet bloc and the American bloc. There was a lot of rivalry brewing between Western countries and the Eastern bloc countries. In such a divided world, in a world of divided geopolitics, India and China introduced a new philosophy, a completely new ideology, which is the principles of Panchsheel. This was later accepted by the UN General Assembly as well. UNGA recognized the validity of Panchsheel. It was adopted by many other organizations as well. For example, Asian and African countries, they all met. There was a Asia-Afro conference that took place in 1950s. They all recognized the importance of following this principle, the Panchsheel principle. In fact, China went on to sign many agreements with, let's say, Indonesia, with Philippines, with Vietnam. In all these agreements, China has placed the Panchsheel principles as the foundation. China started using Panchsheel principles in its relations with other countries as well, right? So Panchsheel gained a lot of acceptance. In fact, many thinkers, many analysts believe this is what laid the foundation for India's non-aligned movement. It was India which championed the non-aligned movement in 1950s. Is that clear? When the Bandung conference took place in 1955 in Indonesia, it was Prime Minister Nehru who brought up the philosophy of non-alignment. India chose a neutral path. We created a third path for the world. Everyone thought there were only two paths, either join US or join Soviet Union, right? But we took a neutral stand and found a new path, a new ideology, and we showed a new path to the other countries as well. So we brought many like-minded countries together, such as Indonesia, Egypt, Ghana, and then Yugoslavia. These were the founding members of non-aligned movement. India, Egypt, Indonesia, the African country of Ghana, and Yugoslavia. These countries, right, which were very close to India, especially Prime Minister Nehru, had very good relations with the leaders of Egypt and these countries. The then leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was a very good friend of India, personal friend of Nehru. So Nehru utilized those links with common like-minded countries, and we got inspired with the Panchsheel principle and laid the foundation for non-aligned movement. We championed the non-aligned movement, created a third path for a world which was divided between democratic and communist ideology. So the Panchsheel was an attempt, a genuine attempt to repair the damage, to repair the relations. But unfortunately, it did not last. It didn't last because of China again. China would go on to trigger the first problem in 1954 by trying to claim Aksai Chin and by starting to build a road via Aksai Chin. Just after the Panchsheel was signed, it was discovered by India that Aksai Chin is seeing a Chinese infiltration. And Aksai Chin was being used by China to build a road, a strategic road that would connect Tibet and Xinjiang. Is that clear? See, when India became independent, we inherited the British era boundaries, be it in Jammu and Kashmir, be it in Ladakh, be it towards Arunachal Pradesh. So across these frontiers, we accepted the British era boundaries that had been drawn. For example, we accepted the India-Nepal border based on Treaty of Sugauli that was signed between British India and the Kingdom of Nepal, right? So we didn't push Nepal to renegotiate the boundary. We accepted the boundaries that the British had left behind because we didn't want to trigger any new conflicts, new disputes. We wanted friendly relations to flourish between our neighbors. So we were under the assumption that these boundaries would be the boundaries of India. But the PRC, which was formed much later in 1949, and it became our neighbor in 1950, all of a sudden, China started questioning the validity of these boundaries. From early 1950s itself, China had sent out some indication, signs, that it may not recognize the British era borders, be it in the Ladakh sector or be it in the Arunachal sector. Aksai Chin in particular, I'll show you the map of the region as well, I'll explain the significance of Aksai Chin. India believed Aksai Chin was very much a part of Ladakh. And this is the right position as well for India, because there are a few British era boundaries drawn here. You have the Johnson Line and a few other British era boundaries drawn, which demarcated the boundaries between Ladakh and Tibet. Tibet was a kingdom, Ladakh was a princely state. So between them, boundaries were drawn by the British, and we had accepted these boundaries. So accordingly, Aksai Chin was supposed to be a part of Ladakh and hence a part of the then state of Jammu and Kashmir. Right? Eventually, when J&K merged with India, Aksai Chin also became an integral part of India. All right? This was India's perception. This is what we thought. But China questioned the validity of this. It directly started claiming the area. It started building a road to connect Tibet and Xinjiang. All right? Now, China was not just interested in the territory here. It was more about the location. It's more about where Aksai Chin is located. It is located right in the middle of Tibet and Xinjiang. This is what interests China. Or else China wouldn't or may not be interested in Aksai Chin. Its primary interest here in Aksai Chin stems from the fact that it's right in between Tibet and Xinjiang. It is sandwiched between the two. As you know, both were problematic regions for China. China had occupied them. There was resistance growing in both the regions. These were the faraway regions of China, right? So in Xinjiang, Uyghurs were rebelling already. Uyghurs especially, they have faced a lot of discrimination from the majority. Uyghur Muslims have been historically oppressed and dominated and targeted by the Han majority, by the Chinese state. Tibetan Buddhists were being targeted. Tibetan Buddhists were trying to rebel. They were trying to, carry out a revolution to fight for their liberation, to fight for their independence. So both were problematic provinces as far as China was concerned. There was an internal security problem according to China, right? Obviously, China didn't see them as liberation movements. It saw them as terrorist movements, as anti-national activities. So because of the security concerns in Tibet and Xinjiang, China wanted to deploy its forces move them around quickly, if necessary, move them between Tibet and Xinjiang, right? So for this security reason and this strategic reason, China kept its eyes on Aksai Chin. Or else, trust me, Aksai Chin most likely wouldn't have been of Chinese interest. It's largely a barren land, it's a cold desert. The primary interest of China here stems from the fact that it is right in between, it is sandwiched between Tibet and Xinjiang. It provides the shortest route, the best route to connect the two, and that is what China wanted, right? So China raised this issue by building a road. It started a road construction and started claiming it belongs to China, and its main purpose was to connect Tibet with Xinjiang. India obviously objected to this. When we discovered the road construction and the Chinese incursion, we objected to it, and India published new maps clearly showing Aksai Chin as Indian territory. All right? Because see, this issue came up because the boundary was never resolved. We had no negotiations on the boundary. We assumed we are inheriting British era boundaries, but China had a different perception, a different viewpoint. So as China questioned the validity of India's sovereignty over Aksai Chin, India countered it by bringing out new maps. We opposed it, and we mobilized troops towards Aksai Chin. Immediately, India deployed troops in Ladakh to counter the Chinese activities, which led to border clashes between the militaries. The Indian Army and the Chinese PLA got into clashes at Aksai Chin in the Ladakh sector and frequent protests. It became a common issue between India and China for several months. So very soon, the principles of Panchsheel was broken. That's why Panchsheel was ineffective. It was a failure. Both the sides didn't respect what they had promised, especially China. Even India has breached it, but it was China which mainly breached the Panchsheel, pushing India to breach Panchsheel as well. Right? China was questioning our sovereignty. It was being aggressive. It was not negotiating. It was not coexisting, treating India as an equal. It was a violation of all the principles of Panchsheel. So as the tensions went up, and as India countered it, as India opposed the Chinese aggression, China tried to get even more aggressive against India. All right? By this point, China started seeing India and US as allies. US was giving India some assistance. It was providing economic assistance to India. Right? We were both democracies. US had its own problems. US was worried that a democratic country was not joining the Western countries. We actually weren't on the same page. But China's perception was India, US are on the same page. All right? So when these tensions and this suspicion was coming up, China came up with another challenge for India. China came up with another challenge. Now it brought up the issue of the McMahon line. The McMahon line was recently in news just a couple of days ago. Right? The US Senate has adopted a resolution recognizing the McMahon line as the boundary between India and China, right, in the Arunachal sector. So the McMahon line, which was drawn by the McMahon Commission, it was drawn between British India and the then Kingdom of Tibet. These are British era boundaries that have been drawn through the Shimla Convention of 1914. Please remember this point. It's very important. During Shimla Convention, right, British India negotiated with Kingdom of Tibet. They set up the McMahon Commission to draw the boundaries to divide British India from Tibet. Remember, Tibet was being set up as a buffer state. Nepal, Ladakh, Bhutan, Sikkim, all these areas, including Tibet, were set up by the British as a buffer, as a security buffer. So British India was negotiating the boundaries to recognize the autonomy of Tibet, the independence of the Tibetan kingdom. So that is when the boundaries were drawn. The McMahon line was drawn, specifically in the eastern sector towards Arunachal. This became the boundary between Tibet and British India. And after 1947, we accepted this boundary. We inherited the British era borders. But later, China in the 1950s started questioning the validity of McMahon line. It questioned India that we can't accept this. China said we were not party to Shimla Convention. When Shimla Convention happened in 1914, when the line was drawn, neither India existed, nor China existed. Right? It was British India. It was Kingdom of Tibet. There was no PRC. There was no the modern Indian state. So China started arguing that this agreement is not valid. This line is not valid. China said we have to negotiate. We have to start fresh negotiations to decide what's the boundary between India and China. India rejected this outright. India was very angry, and India rejected this Chinese claim. And it became very clear what China was trying to do. It was a Chinese strategy, a strategy to distract India, to put pressure on India, to put India on the back foot. Because see, China doesn't care much about Arunachal Pradesh, to be very honest. Is that clear? Not much. But China meddles in Arunachal Pradesh. It keeps triggering problems for India in Arunachal Pradesh because it wants to control Aksai Chin. It wants to control Tibet. This is China's primary motivation. See, if you look at China's initial claims, China initially did not claim Arunachal Pradesh. It didn't question McMahon line. This came only after India opposed Chinese claim of Aksai Chin. Basically, what China was doing was that it was opening new disputes deliberately meddling in Arunachal Pradesh to create new challenges for India so that if ever there is a negotiation and a settlement, China can suggest a trade-off. This, in fact, happened as well in late 1950s. China gave a suggestion. There was a proposal that came from China. China said, see, we will recognize McMahon line. We will say, okay, Arunachal is your territory, but you should accept Aksai Chin as our territory. It suggested a quid pro quo, an exchange. Now, this was unacceptable to India. We rejected this outright because legitimately, Arunachal and Aksai Chin both belong to India. What China had done, it had changed the status quo. This is a classic Chinese tactic. It changed the status quo by building the road in Aksai Chin, by claiming Aksai Chin, and by changing the perception that as if Aksai Chin never belonged to India. By showing that Aksai Chin belongs to China, it was willing to give up Arunachal in exchange for Aksai Chin. It was creating that kind of perception. But the reality is both the territories were very much a part of India. China started referring to Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. It started calling the region as South Tibet, as an extension of Tibet. It said we don't recognize McMahon line. This was all deliberate to interfere in Arunachal Pradesh, to create a new dispute, to create a diversion for India, to put India under pressure, and force India to accept an exchange where India will, get the Arunachal region. China will accept that in return for India giving the claims over Aksai Chin. All right. Now, please remember the five-finger policy I had discussed in a previous class. Mao Zedong's five-finger policy. What did Mao Zedong say? Mao Zedong said, if China has to control Tibet, if it has to have firm control on Tibet, then China has to meddle. China has to interfere in the five fingers of Tibet, the five extensions of Tibet, which is Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Arunachal Pradesh. This has been Chinese strategy since then. Honestly, even today, it's the same. It's an extension of the same strategy. For China to retain control on Tibet, to ensure Tibet remains an integral part of China, it has followed this five-finger policy of Mao Zedong to destabilize the boundaries of Tibet. Right? All the other Himalayan regions are destabilized by China. It meddles here, it interferes here. That's why it questioned McMahon line, calls it South Tibet, calls Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. That's why it laid its eyes on Aksai Chin, because it was strategically located to connect Tibet and Xinjiang and occupied Aksai Chin. Right? Meddled in Ladakh. It meddled in Nepal, as we have discussed. It meddled in Bhutan, as we have discussed in the recent classes. It didn't recognize Sikkim as a part of India for many, many years. Until 2003, China never recognized Sikkim as part of India. This is a classic Chinese strategy of being aggressive, pushing the opponent, and trying to change the status quo and pushing the other side to accept this as the new status quo. That's what China does. It shows aggression. It even goes on to occupy some territory. It shifts the boundary, shifts the status quo itself, then forces the other side to accept that this is the status quo. Now we will negotiate. Now that is not acceptable. If you're negotiating, you have to negotiate from where it started, right? Now China had more or less controlled Aksai occupied it by this point of time, and on the other hand, it was questioning Arunachal Pradesh and its, and its sovereignty with regard to India. There was no way India could accept this. India rejected these claims, and India also started reacting, started opposing it. We started mobilizing troops to the region to counter the Chinese aggressive claims. Like I said, it even led to clashes between the troops, right? But China was very clear. It was just changing the status quo, putting India under pressure. It was a classic implementation of the five-finger policy. All right. So this is the beginning. This is the origin of the border dispute, the border conflict between India and China. All right. Now that you understood what happened, what is the history behind it, let's look at the maps. Let's understand the 1962 war, and let's talk about the current border disputes as well. I'll show you a couple of important maps. I'll give you some basic details, and after that, we'll take a short break. All right. I'm showing you the disputed map of India. All right. I know it's a disputed map. Don't take offense to it. I know we live in very delicate, sensitive times, but trust me, you need a disputed map here to understand the dispute. All right. Or yes, we use official map of India everywhere else, but to understand the nature of the dispute, you should look at the disputed map. All right. There are some who take offense to this, but don't. Be a mature audience, right? Here you can see Pakistan occupied Kashmir. This is POK, right? You can see LOC, the line of control. Next, you can see this region here, which is Shaksgam Valley. The small region here is Shaksgam Valley. It's actually part of Gilgit-Baltistan, supposed to be Indian territory. But Pakistan has gifted this to China. Remember, I had mentioned this while talking about Pakistan. Pakistan has given away a part of Indian territory to China. It is this region, the Shaksgam Valley. Next, this here is Aksai Chin. This is the area occupied by China. You can clearly see what I was talking about. You can clearly notice that Aksai Chin, it is sandwiched between Tibet. See, this is Tibet here. This is Xinjiang here. And right between them, you have Aksai Chin. That is why China is so obsessed with Aksai Chin. Because it connects Xinjiang and Tibet in a strategic location. It's easy to build a road. China has always believed this is vital to control Xinjiang and Tibet. Eventually, China captured Aksai Chin, right, by 1962 war. When the war ended, China had fully captured Aksai Chin from India. So it is Chinese occupied territory. So here we have a temporary border, a de facto border called LAC, the line of actual control. Since it's an active dispute, it's an ongoing conflict, in the Ladakh sector, the temporary border between India and China is called LAC, line of actual control. This, along with the borders along Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand, this represents the western sector of the border. The western sector of the India-China border, from Ladakh till Uttarakhand, till this junction here with Nepal, till Kalapani. Remember, we studied Kalapani dispute, Lipu Lake Pass. This is where it is located, at the junction of India, Nepal, and China. So from the Siachen Glacier, from the Karakoram ranges, all the way till Lipu Lake, this is the western sector of the India-China border. Next, we have the middle sector that is represented by Sikkim. This is Sikkim here. This is the middle sector of the border, shared between Tibet and Sikkim. Again, we have looked at this region when we spoke about India-Bhutan. When we discussed the Doklam issue, I explained the Natula Pass as well in Sikkim. This is where the middle sector of the border is located. And finally, you have the eastern sector. The eastern sector of India-China border that you see here in the map, it's very clearly visible. That is in Arunachal. This line you see here is the McMahon line. The boundary, the British era boundary between Tibet and Arunachal Pradesh. China does not recognize this and calls Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. So essentially, today's boundaries between India and China can be divided into three sectors: the western sector, the middle sector, and the eastern sector. And all across these sectors, we have multiple disputes. In Arunachal Pradesh, in parts of Sikkim, right, Bhutan and China, and across Ladakh, Himachal and Uttarakhand. In all these areas, there are multiple disputes, and China keeps carrying out multiple incursions at these locations. All right. Now, please pay attention to this map here. I want you to make a note of some important locations I'm going to mark. They can be very important for map-based questions. Mark the Shaksgam Valley over here. It's part of POK, Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Clearly note the LOC, the Siachen Glacier, which we studied in the previous class. Remember, I explained the location of Siachen. You can clearly see here in the map how it is strategically located between Pakistan occupied areas, Chinese occupied areas, and Xinjiang, which is Chinese territory. In such a critical region, Siachen is located. That's why it's vital for India to control Siachen. All right. You can see Aksai Chin, occupied by China. The line of actual control. You can see Sikkim, the middle sector, the McMahon line in the eastern sector. All right. Now, if you specifically look at the Ladakh sector, there are some important locations which are in news. This is the Karakoram Pass next to Shaksgam Valley. Daulat Beg Oldi, these are Indian territories. They are under Indian control. India has access to the Karakoram Pass and the Daulat Beg Oldi region. Here, many incursions have happened. That's why I'm pointing it out. Chinese troops and Indian troops have clashed at Daulat Beg Oldi many times. We have even activated an advanced landing ground. The Indian Air Force has activated an advanced landing ground here at DBO. Right? It's a British era runway. During World War, the British had created a semi-prepared runway to land certain aircraft, transport aircraft especially. These old runways along India-China border have been reactivated by the Indian Air Force. They're called advanced landing grounds. It's not an air base, it's not an airport, it's just a semi-prepared runway. Right? It won't even be tarred or cemented. It's a semi-prepared runway where helicopters and transport aircraft can land to deploy troops and equipment to the forward areas. So DBO is vital for India. It's a forward position, and the Indian Army dominates the Daulat Beg Oldi region. You can see Siachen Glacier again here. Next, you can see the Rakal Nala, another flashpoint. The Spangnur Gap, where we recently witnessed clashes between India and China. During the latest Ladakh crisis, India actually countered China and delivered a blow to China. Through a special operation, we captured the heights of Spangnur Gap and pushed China back. It was a special operation carried out by the Special Frontier Force, which is a covert wing of RAW. India's Intelligence Agency Research and Analysis Wing has a special operations branch called SFF, the Special Frontier Force. The SFF, along with the Indian Army, carried out a special covert operation during the crisis. We pushed the Chinese back at Spangnur Gap and occupied the heights of the Spangnur Gap. All right, you can see the Panongso Lake, which is popularized by various movies, a very popular tourist spot. It is shared between India and China. All right, part of it lies in India, part of it lies in China. You can see the Depsangla Plains next to LOC, next to the line of actual control. Here as well, there have been many incursions. Even recently, the clashes and tensions took place here. You can see Leh, the Leh district of Ladakh. Chushul is another important sector. Chumur Ranges, the Zifpugi La, which is a pass connecting Ladakh with Himachal, and Demchok, another flashpoint between India and China. You can also see the Shipkila Pass in Himachal. So all these are important locations. Right? In Uttarakhand, you have the Lipu Lake Pass. Across these points, we have had many incursions in the last many years. China has carried out many incursions across these vital locations, even at Nathula in Sikkim, right, near Doklam, right, towards the Chumbi Valley. Right? China reaches out from Chumbi Valley and threatens India at Nathula and threatens Bhutan at Doklam. We have seen this map in a previous class. Next, in Arunachal, it's Tawang, which is the flashpoint. Tawang is a major flashpoint, which I explained under India-Bhutan. So like this, there are some important locations along the border areas that you should be familiar with. They are frequently in news. It keeps coming up again and again. We have had many clashes, incursions. That is why you should have familiarity with these places. All right. So with this, we have discussed the basic points related to our border dispute. Now let's take a short break. Let's take a 15 minutes break. We'll come back at 7:45. All right. Let's come back at 7:45. I'll resume the discussion. We'll talk about the events leading to 1962 war. We'll understand what happened, how the ties have developed after the war. Right. We'll go through the important events in a chronological order and come to the present day relations. We'll discuss the current clashes. Aggressive against India, how China started claiming Indian. Hello everyone, welcome back to the session. Now let's talk about the important events that happened from 1958, 1959 onwards, which laid the ground for the 1962 conflict between India and China. You have already understood what happened between 1949 and 1958. We saw the initial friendly relations that developed. We saw the annexation of Tibet and how India was concerned, how suspicion and distrust came up between the relationship. We understood how China got aggressive against India, how China started claiming Indian territory in Aksai Chin, in Arunachal Pradesh as well. And we also saw one attempt to repair the damage by signing the Panchsheel Agreement. But the Panchsheel principles were very quickly broken, first by China, then by India as well. So from 1955 itself, the border tensions were escalating. China was making active preparations. China was much ahead of India when it came to military preparedness. China was not only deploying adequate troops, it was also carrying out infrastructure development in the disputed border areas. This is where the policies of the then Nehru government has been criticized. Prime Minister Nehru and Krishna Menon, V. Krishna Menon, who was the defense minister of India during the war, both have been heavily criticized for not preparing adequately as compared to Chinese preparedness. See, of course, China had a geographical advantage. Because for China, it was any day easier to create infrastructure in Tibet because Tibet is a plateau, a flat land, right? For India, there was a geographical challenge. We have to go up the Himalayan mountains. It was always a challenge for India to create the right infrastructure. But however, this is not a reason enough to escape the blame for the military unpreparedness, which eventually led to the devastating defeat of India. So by 1950s, there were clear indications that China was getting aggressive day by day. There were intelligence reports from the IB that China was stepping up its troop deployment. It was creating the right infrastructure to quickly mobilize troops, and it was solidifying its position, whereas India was on the back foot. And the then Indian leadership has been blamed for not preparing adequately for what China was planning. In 1959, at a point when the border tensions were already high, there was a massive uprising in Tibet led by the Tibetan Buddhists. The Tibetan Buddhists rose up in rebellion, trying to fight for their independence. This rebellion was crushed by China. China crushed the rebellion using massive force, and it committed large-scale human rights violations. China didn't hesitate to violate basic rights. It used massive force to crush the rebellion, which triggered a refugee crisis that would end up having an impact on India. A massive refugee crisis was triggered. Thousands of Tibetan Buddhists, along with their spiritual leader Dalai Lama, they fled Tibet to save themselves, and they sought asylum in India. They sought protection in India, and India granted asylum, took in the refugees. India settled the refugees. And more importantly, we even allowed a parallel Tibetan government to be formed in India. Is that clear? India criticized the violation of human rights in Tibet. India criticized China for carrying out this violation of human rights. In a way, we were backing the uprising, at least indirectly. And when the refugee crisis got triggered, right, along with Dalai Lama, when thousands of refugees came down the Himalayas, India took them in, gave them asylum, accepted them as Tibetan refugees. India settled them in Tibetan camps. Even today, you find the refugee camps. There's one at Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh. At Dharamshala is where the Dalai Lama sits as well. This is where a large Tibetan settlement camp was set up by India, right? Even today, this is where Dalai Lama sits. And here we have allowed the Tibetans to form a parallel government. Even today, it is active. There is a parallel Tibetan government in India, a government in exile, which was allowed to function out of India back then. There's one more camp in Karnataka. Near Madikeri, there's a place called Kushalnagar between Mysore and Madikeri or Coorg. So there's a place called Kushalnagar where you find a large Tibetan settlement. So these are the two places where the refugees were settled. We took them as refugees, allowed a parallel government to function in exile. So when India did this, it angered China because according to China, India was helping the anti-Chinese elements. India was directly supporting the separatist movement. Because from China's angle, this was a separatist movement. This was an anti-national attempt by the Tibetans. So when India gave shelter to the Tibetan refugees, and when India criticized China's handling of the crisis and the violation of human rights, China concluded that India had turned hostile. China concluded that India had become hostile. It was backing the Tibetan liberation movement, and China now set a target to teach India a lesson, to put India in its place. This was China's thinking. Because by now, India, US were on the same page as far as the crisis in Tibet was concerned. US was also critical of China. Obviously, the Western countries, they opposed what China had done. US cut off all relations with China as well. And the US was looking to exert more pressure on China. So as India and US had the same position, it further led China to conclude that India and US were on the same page. It's not true at all. India and US had a lot of differences, right? But still, there were areas where we had common interests. So China started seeing India as a Western ally. So immediately the tension started escalating, and China deployed more troops, mobilized more troops by 1960-61. And now China had an objective to fully capture and formally annex Aksai, and it had an objective to push India back, to teach India a lesson for accepting the Tibetan refugees. This became a trigger for China to get more aggressive, right? And as China started deploying more troops, the Nehru government did one more strategic blunder. It's called the forward policy of Prime Minister Nehru. Under the forward policy, India also started mobilizing troops. India started mobilizing troops to the forward areas without the right preparation, without the right capabilities. See, in geopolitics, it's very, very important to be realistic. You should first gauge and understand your own capabilities. At that point, India was clearly outmatched by China in terms of military power. China was a vastly superior military power. China has maintained this military edge even today against India, right? The military advice was that we shouldn't directly counter the Chinese mobilization. It could potentially lead to a clash or a war. And India was not prepared. We weren't adequately prepared. There was lack of preparedness. And India was outnumbered, and it was completely put on the back foot. According to several reports, during this period, let's say around 1961-62, right before the war began, the troop ratio was 3:1. For every one Indian soldier, China had deployed 3 soldiers. So Indian army was clearly outnumbered. The PLA had a clear edge, clear advantage. They had superior infrastructure and superior equipment. China had created the road rail network needed to mobilize the troops, set up the military facilities closer to provide all the logistical support. It had better weapons and platforms as well compared to India. Plus, India had to deal with the problem of terrain. We had the disadvantage, a natural disadvantage created by the Himalayan mountains, right? Not easy to build infrastructure there, not easy to mobilize the troops. The Indian army lacked the capabilities for a mountain warfare. It didn't specialize in mountain warfare back then. It didn't have the right equipment, the right training to fight these high altitude battles, whereas China clearly had an edge. So based on this, every advice indicated that India should reach out for a settlement. We shouldn't escalate further. Because if you escalate blindly, if it leads to a war, we are going to lose. It was certain. The only option here would have been the diplomatic option. To avert war, where we would have definitely lost the war, it was very clear that India was on the back foot. It was always suggested to employ the diplomatic option, right? Diplomacy is what prevents war. Diplomacy is what helps you protect your interests without resorting to force. So logic dictated, and every advice to the government dictated that India should reach out and work out a diplomatic settlement, at least for the time being. But instead, then Defense Minister Krishna Menon went for a mobilization of troops. Under Prime Minister Nehru, India went for a very aggressive approach without the capabilities. See, if you're aggressive with capabilities, that is different. Without the required capabilities, if you're getting aggressive, what's the point? So under forward policy, India started deploying troops, more troops to forward positions, and this led China to conclude that India was preparing for a war. This was an escalation from India. You can escalate, yes, but you escalate when you have the capabilities to defend. The Indian army didn't have those capabilities, and ideally we should have reached out for a diplomatic settlement, right? Or we should have prepared earlier. There should have been military preparedness. So when this was lacking, adopting the forward policy was a blunder, was a mistake, and it led China to get even more aggressive. And now China decided that India had to be taught a lesson. It declared war against India, carried out a massive incursion across the entire sector of the border, and very quickly delivered a crushing defeat for India. This was expected, right? As China launched the war, we lost the war across all sectors. In Ladakh, in Arunachal Pradesh, and of course in Sikkim. Across all sectors, China invaded into Indian territory. China's primary objective was to cement its position in Aksai Chin. It fully captured Aksai Chin and made deep inroads into Indian territory. Indian forces were outnumbered, right? It delivered a crushing defeat on India, and China even held Indian territory for a short period, even in Arunachal Pradesh and other parts. Later, China itself unilaterally called for a ceasefire as it had achieved its objectives. China's objective was to occupy Aksai Chin. That was the top priority. Second was to teach India a lesson, to put India on the back foot. Since both objectives were achieved, China called for a ceasefire, ended the war, and surprisingly retreated as well. It retreated from other areas, in Arunachal and few other areas, where China had actually held Indian territory. All right, so this is how the 62 war happened and came to an end. It was a pretty quick war. Even though India resisted, India didn't stand a chance. We were outnumbered. China was much superior, and it delivered a crushing defeat on India. This loss was a psychological blow for India. It hit the mindset of the Indian government, the Indian armed forces and the intelligence agencies, and the Indian public. Right? Everyone started to look at China as an imminent threat, as enemy number one, as a country which could eat up India, because India had lost the war conclusively. Right? This also directly contributed to a nexus between China and Pakistan. It was natural, it was bound to happen, because Kautilya has this theory. Kautilya of Chanakya, who wrote Arthashastra. In the Arthashastra, he brings out the Mandala theory. All right, Arthashastra is not just a treatise about administration, economics, revenue management. It's not just that. Arthashastra of Kautilya is one of the leading works, not just in public administration, but also with regard to foreign policy and national security. Kautilya dealt with all these aspects. He dealt with war, espionage, covert operations, terrorism, etc. That is why Arthashastra is studied even today. Right? It has relevance even today. Under the Mandala theory, Kautilya said, Ari's Ari is a mitra, meaning your enemy's enemy is a friend. This is a classic geopolitical strategy. You build friendly relations with your enemy's enemy, with your Ari's Ari. For example, India built very close relations with the Afghan government, which was a hostile threat as far as Pakistan is concerned. Pakistan, right, has been opposed by both India and Afghan government when the Afghan government was present. It was natural for India and the Afghan government to align together to counter Pakistan. Similarly, Pakistan and China aligned against India following the war. By then, Pakistan had already fought the 47 war with India. The Kashmir conflict was already going on. Now that China, India also became hostile, permanently hostile, a nexus started developing. A nexus developed between China and Pakistan. It led the two to sign a boundary agreement, the Sino-Pak Boundary Agreement of 1963, through which parts of Karakoram Range, specifically the Shaksdam Valley, was leased to China. Pakistan gave away this territory to China. Even today, China has control over Shaksgam Valley along with Pakistan. This is Indian territory. Should have been a part of Gilgit-Baltistan and the larger state of Jammu and Kashmir. Right? Pakistan had occupied these areas and now it gave away this small part of Karakoram to China for strategic reasons, because via Shaksgam Valley, China could connect with Pakistan and both of them together could surround India. So China has deployed troops in Shaksgam Valley since then. Even today, you find PLA troops here. China has built a lot of infrastructure. It has built road, railway network through Shaksgam Valley. And this is what concerns India. It remains a problem, a challenge even today. Right? So this was a direct outcome of the war. India not only lost the war, we lost Aksai Chin permanently as well. China occupied it. And it was a crushing defeat, a psychological blow. Plus the ties between China and Pakistan grew substantially. They became strategic partners, a nexus developed between them. And since then, China and Pakistan often work together to counter India. In many ways, they are aligned together. China helped Pakistan build its armed forces. China played a critical role in the nuclearization of Pakistan. China would leak nuclear secrets, help Pakistan directly to build a nuclear bomb. It helped Pakistan to procure advanced military equipment, including leaking of missile and rocket technology. Pakistan could have never developed this on its own. It was China which leaked such sensitive technologies to Pakistan, because now Pakistan had become a proxy for China. It was setting up Pakistan as a counter to India, so India would be dragged down by Pakistan, thereby handling Chinese concerns. China's strategy was very simple. Prop up Pakistan as a major military power. Pakistan will do the rest. It will counter India, distract India, thus keeping India away from China. So this nexus became stronger day by day. Right? Today, Pakistan has ballistic missiles, submarines, fighter jets, and a nuclear bomb. Large part of it is because of China. It not only gave the technology, it gave funds, it has assisted Pakistan in every possible way. When Pakistan launched its covert war, when it sponsored terrorism against India, even then, China gave diplomatic support, especially at the UN. This continues even today. Even today, when Pakistan is accused of terrorism at the UN, China protects Pakistan. China uses its veto power as a permanent member of the Security Council and shields Pakistan. So this nexus started forming from 1960s, especially after the war. The China-Pakistan nexus strengthened, thereby posing a two-front threat to India. A combined threat. Indian military planners have always perceived this as the biggest threat, a nightmare for India, where we might get into a simultaneous war with China and Pakistan. It is very much possible. It's possible for a simultaneous war to break out on both the fronts with Pakistan and China. Let's say if border clashes escalate leading to a war between India and China, it is possible China might push Pakistan to target India. China might use its leverage on Pakistan and force Pakistan to target India to launch a simultaneous war. So since then, this has been a nightmare situation for India's strategic establishment. Since then, India has been gearing up for a possible two-front conflict. Right? So this was a direct consequence of the war, and the psychological blow was so severe that India's leadership went into a negative mindset. India's strategic establishment and the leadership, they went into a negative mindset that lasted for several years. From 1962 to 2004, the government of India, the armed forces, the intelligence agencies, all the concerned institutions, the defense ministry, home ministry, of course the prime minister's office, they all had a negative approach towards China. Since China became a much larger threat than it was, right? During these years, from 62 to 2004, India adopted a negative policy of not developing border infrastructure. We deliberately adopted a policy of not developing border infrastructure because we feared a possible Chinese invasion. The fear was, if you create border roads, bridges, and railway links in the border areas, if there's a future war, then we are making it easier for China to invade into India. The fear was China will make use of the same infrastructure to further invade deeper into India. This is a very negative thinking. It was a negative mindset. It's because of the psychological blow. The government, all the branches of the government, the armed forces, the strategic establishment, they were all governed by this negative mindset at least until 2004. We weren't proactive in creating border infrastructure. This was not a failure. It was a deliberate policy. A deliberate policy of subsequent governments to not create border infrastructure closer to the areas, to not trigger China, to not allow China to use the roads and rail networks to further penetrate into India if there is a war. Right? So we went into such a defensive mindset. That is the right term to use. It developed a defensive mindset in India's strategic establishment. That was the impact of the 1962 war. This defensive mindset was changed only after 2004. From 2004 onwards, you see a proactive approach from India. You see a clear proactive approach starting from the Vajpayee administration. It actually began with the Vajpayee government. It was continued and built by the Manmohan Singh government. Now it has been taken forward by the Modi government. So the last three regimes in India, let's say from early 2000, have transformed this policy. Is that clear? So now we are more proactive when it comes to countering China. We no longer have the same defensive mindset. In the last 20 years at least, 20 to 23 years, India has taken proactive steps to create border infrastructure. We have modernized our armed forces as well to match up to Chinese capabilities and to counter China. So you see that military preparedness today. In the last 20 years, we have built those capabilities to counter China, and the required infrastructure also is being created. We have built strategic roads, created railway infrastructure, built important bridges and tunnels, deployed advanced forces in the front lines, correct? Procured advanced weaponry as well. We have reactivated the runways, the airstrips of the World War era, advanced landing grounds, so our aircraft can land in forward areas and deploy the troops quickly. So all these proactive measures have been taken to improve our military preparedness. You see this happening only in the last 20 to 23 years. But before that, for 4 decades, India was ruled by a defensive mindset. China became a much larger threat than it actually was. Right? So this was the long-lasting impact of the 62 war. So obviously, relations became hostile for many years. Right? So this was the long-lasting impact. Lasting impact of the 62 war. So obviously, relations became hostile for many years. There was a complete breakdown of relations for at least 20 plus years, from 1962 to almost 1980s. This entire period was a hostile period. We barely had any friendly equation. There were fresh clashes in the Sikkim sector at Natula and Chola. Fresh clashes took place here at Sikkim, and many say that this is what pushed India to meddle in Sikkim, to force Sikkim's merger into the Indian Union. This is not verified, of course. It's not publicly acknowledged information, but however, many experts believe that the crisis in the Chogyal dynasty was created by RAW. It was India's covert operation, which led to the crisis in the Chogyal dynasty that forced Sikkim to merge with India in 1970s, in 1974. Many analysts believe this would have happened because of the clashes, the threat China was posing to Natula and Chola. Natula is a strategic pass. I've helped you understand this in a previous session. Considering the significance of Sikkim, it is believed that India forced Sikkim to join with India by triggering and creating a crisis. All right. So as Sikkim merged with India, China did not recognize this. And others got scared. Nepal. We studied how Nepal was worried when Sikkim merged with India. Right. So China wouldn't recognize Sikkim as Indian territory for many, many years. For more than almost 30 years, China would not recognize Sikkim as Indian territory. During the 1971 war, again we were divided. We were on the opposite sides. We abandoned non-alignment, as we discussed, and we aligned with Soviet Union. As US became hostile and started supporting Pakistan, and as US threatened India, we abandoned non-alignment and sided with the Soviet Union. Whereas China was seen to be in between. It had just established ties with US. The US was even trying to use China to push India against India, to push China to act against India during the war. Remember I told you that in 1970, it was a priority for then US government to build ties with China, to rebuild the relations. And Pakistan was helping the US. It was mediating between US and China. The US was trying to pull China away from the communist power bloc, to pull it away from Soviet influence. All right. At that point, when US and China were negotiating and talking to each other about establishing their ties, it tried to push China to act against India during the war to protect Pakistan. But however, China didn't take the call. It didn't want to intervene in this India-Pakistan conflict. Though it kept supporting Pakistan through weapons and funds, it wouldn't get directly involved in the war. It stayed out of it. But however, during this period, it was very clear that we were again on opposite sides. Then there were fresh border clashes again, especially in 1987. Since we both had a different perception of the border, we both believed to have different boundaries. Every now and then there would be incursions where Chinese troops would enter Indian territory. Sometimes Indian troops would also enter territory claimed by China. This would lead to clashes between the troops, and especially in 1987, there was a major border clash that escalated. So this whole period was a hostile period for the relationship. For more than 20 years, India-China were very hostile to each other. Then came the biggest breakthrough in 1988. 1988 started a new era, a new phase in India-China relations. If you ask me, I would divide India-China relations into different phases. To simplify the understanding, we can break it down into different phases. In 1949, a new era, a new phase in India-China relations. If you ask me, I would divide India-China relations into different phases. To simplify the understanding, we can break it down into different phases. In 1949, I would say it was friendly. From 1950 to 54, it was based on suspicion and distrust of each other. From 1954 to 1962, you saw an escalation of tensions. Of course, after the war, from 62 to 87, we saw the continuation of hostile relations. But 1988 was a breakthrough year. All right, I'll explain what happened. But before that, let me point out the different phases of the relationship. From 1988 to, let's say, 2000, this was the period of repair. The relationship was repaired. There were many important visits, many important agreements that were signed that provide for some normalization in the relationship. There was only one break here in 98 when India conducted its nuclear tests. Obviously, China opposed the Pokhran nuclear tests. China has always opposed our nuclear program because India's nuclear weapons program is primarily targeted at China, not Pakistan. Pakistan is a secondary target of the nuclear program. China is the primary target. Our program was launched mainly to build deterrence against China because China already possessed nuclear weapons. So when India tested nuclear weapons in 98, obviously China was the one which was being weakened. The balance of power was shifting. India now had deterrence, nuclear deterrence against China. So China worked with US and other countries to punish India by imposing sanctions, economic sanctions. China criticized India, the tensions increased, it triggered an arms race in South Asia. China accelerated its weapons program to retain its edge over India, which pushed India to enter the arms race, and that brought Pakistan as well into the arms race. So all three nuclear powers got into an arms race, and there was an impact on India-China relations. But this was a period where both countries were focusing on repairing the relationship. They knew they had many opportunities to cooperate. They knew they had a lot of economic opportunities, a lot of geopolitical concerns, where they had common interests. So they made a genuine attempt to repair the relationship. This was a period of repair. There was just a small break when the nuclear test happened. From 2000 to 2010, this honestly is the best period in the relationship. This was a period where the relations flourished. The ties between India and China was flourishing throughout this decade. From 2000 to 2010, there was a lot of improvement happening, not just with regard to our economic ties. We were actually collaborating at various global platforms. I'll discuss that later. Our trade and investment was booming. We were even making attempts to resolve the boundary issue, the border dispute. So honestly, this was the best period in the relationship. But after this, from 2010 to let's say 2020, China was sending confusing signals to India. It started sending confusing signals to India. On one hand, it would start getting hostile again. On the other hand, it was still cooperating with India. We saw that duality during the last decade. There were areas where China was aggressive. It was hostile, putting pressure on India, targeting India. There were areas where we were still working together, trying to cooperate, trying to be friends. So this was a slightly confusing period where China was sending confused signals. But 2020 made it very clear that China will not stop being an aggressive country and being a hostile country against India. Currently, we are in this phase. Currently, our relations have been broken. China has become extremely aggressive and hostile. And as of now, there's no scope for improvement in the India-China relationship. This is how I would classify the relations to make it easier to understand. You don't have to go into all the details. See, I'm discussing some of the details for your better understanding. But from an examination point of view, the broad understanding is what is more important, right? So try and do this for every country, right? Create a mind map, revise whatever we have discussed, write down the different phases in the relationship. Let's say India-Pakistan. How was the relations from 1947 to let's say 1971? From 1971 to 1998, 98 to now. So like this, you can divide the relations into different phases with any country. That makes it easier for you to remember and recollect. You can write down the key points next to that so that everything is in one place. It's like a mind map, and you can remember all the events, and you can easily bring this out in your answers as well, right? So this is how our relations have progressed. But the biggest breakthrough was in the year 1988 when then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi paid a historic visit to China. So this is how our relations have progressed so that everything is in one place. It's like a mind map, and you can remember all the events, and you can easily bring this out in your answers as well, right? So this is how our relations have progressed. But the biggest breakthrough was in the year 1988, when then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi paid a historic visit to China. This was the attempt to repair the relationship, and both were equally invested. What drove them together was primarily the economic necessity. China had opened up its economy. It had introduced large-scale economic reforms. It had embraced capitalism. That's quite ironic. A communist country, politically China is communist, right? It's an authoritarian communist country where there are no democratic rights. But the economic model of China is very different. It's a capitalist model. China is much more capitalist than even US or Western countries. So from 1970s, 1980s itself, China started reforming itself. It started reforming its society, its economy, opened up its economy, and now it was looking for partners. It needed new markets. It needed raw materials. It needed investments as well. It wanted places where it can invest. Obviously, India was a very, very attractive option. A large country with a huge market, great potential for growth. This is what drove China to get closer to India, and India also had similar necessities. So we started opening up to each other, all right? So Rajiv Gandhi's visit was extremely crucial to lay the foundation. It helped in repairing the damage, in addressing the hostile tensions that were there, and this laid the foundation for other visits in the next decade, where many important agreements were signed to reduce the tensions and hostility. A few years later, in 1993, then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao built upon what Rajiv Gandhi had achieved. Rajiv Gandhi's visit just opened up the relationship. New phase began. Slightly friendly ties started happening. This was taken forward by Narasimha Rao by signing two important border agreements. Two extremely important border agreements were signed, one in the year 1993 and the second in the year 1996. These agreements are relevant even today. They are extremely important even today. It is in news as well, and hence you should know what these border agreements are. You should know what they deal with. See, as India and China were looking to work with each other, right? For China, India was becoming a huge market. Even we opened up our economy in 91. After facing the economic crisis, we introduced LPG reforms. India had opened up for investments. We were trading with the rest of the world, right? So China saw a huge opportunity in India. So it's natural for the two countries to come together. So they agreed to resolve some of the border differences by signing agreements so that there can be established protocols on how to deal with the border incident. Because unless and until the border is finalized, these incursions will keep happening. Incursions will be common because of the differing perception of both sides. The Indian army has a different perception of the border. So there's every possibility of the Indian army carrying out an incursion into territory claimed by China. Sometimes it is accidental, sometimes it could be deliberate. Similarly, China has a different perception of the border. It might carry out an incursion into Indian territory, right? Either by accident or by deliberate plan. These incursions will keep happening. It will not stop. You cannot allow each incursion to escalate. You can't allow a small incursion to escalate into a bigger conflict with a potential for a full-fledged war between nuclear armed states. This was the thinking that drove India-China to set up established protocols via agreements. So they both could neutralize any incident at the very beginning, at the root itself. The idea is to nip the tensions in the bud, cut off the tensions at the local level itself without allowing for any unnecessary escalation, without risking further tensions, possible conflict and a war. To prevent this worst case scenario, the two sides established certain protocols on how they are going to deal with border incursions. That is exactly what these agreements deal with. The 1993 agreement on peace and tranquility along the line of actual control was signed. It defines how the Chinese PLA and how the Indian army, how both of them should behave along the border areas. Is that clear? Both PLA and Indian army, they have been placed under a few restrictions. There are certain established protocols to de-escalate and disengage from any standoff. There are dedicated communication channels to ensure both sides can talk to each other and resolve any difference. All such mechanisms have been created by this agreement. It mandates both the sides to maintain peace and tranquility, to maintain a peaceful posture along the disputed boundary. If at all there is an incursion, right, there are established protocols that kick in according to the agreement. For example, let's say India and Chinese troops have clashed, right? A face-off has taken place between them. Immediately, the governments will not get involved. They'll not bring reinforcements, they'll not escalate. Instead, the local military commanders, they will use the dedicated communication channels to talk to each other. They will make an immediate attempt to resolve the issue at the local level itself. They'll try to neutralize the issue at the grassroots without allowing it to escalate further. If they fail, then senior commanders will get involved. The brigade level commanders, going all the way to the headquarters of the army and the PLA, the service chiefs. If required, they will get involved to resolve the dispute. They'll try to handle it at the local level. Let's say there's a clash at Tawang. We will not allow the clash at Tawang to escalate into a bigger conflict, let's say in Ladakh. That shouldn't happen. Wherever the clash has happened, we have limited to that. Discuss, negotiate, and talk to each other at different levels of the armed forces and the government and resolve the differences and settle the dispute. Ensure you de-escalate and disengage. That is the primary purpose of the border agreement. It restricts both the sides from opening fire along the border. That is the reason why when you read news reports of a clash between India and China, you see that it's as if two criminal gangs or goons have fought against each other. It's as if your street gangs were fighting against each other. Because they beat up each other, they get into a hand-to-hand combat. They throw stones at each other, they use cricket bats or baseball bats or hockey sticks to beat up each other. Now, why do they fight in such a rudimentary method? Right? When we have modern weapons, why don't they open fire? They can't open fire because there's a restriction. The treaty restricts PLA and the Indian army to not use heavy weaponry. They can't even deploy or carry heavy weaponry, and they're prohibited from opening fire against each other. That is why it's a critical agreement. It maintains peace and tranquility. That's why when clashes happen, when there's an incursion, when there's a standoff, there's a hand-to-hand fight. You would have seen the videos as well. Right? Both sides, the soldiers are beating up each other like street gangs, throwing stones and beating each other with sticks and any other rudimentary tool. But you never see an incident where troops open fire against each other and kill each other. That will not happen here. It's been prohibited. It's been restricted under the peace and tranquility agreement. This is absolutely important. Imagine if there are standoffs happening every now and then, and troops open fire and kill a lot of soldiers on the other side. Obviously, it will be seen as an act of war. It will escalate very quickly, and you never know, it might become a full-fledged conflict and a war. This is something we can't afford between nuclear armed states. That is why these mechanisms have been put in place. We signed a follow-up agreement in 1996. It's an agreement on confidence building measures. It focuses on building confidence in each other, making each other trust the other side. For example, there will be military exercises planned. We actually had a joint military exercise called Hand in Hand. This was a joint exercise between Indian Army and the PLA. It's been suspended now, but a few years back when things were good, we actually had a joint military exercise called Hand in Hand. There's a cultural exchange also, which is enabled between Indian and Chinese troops. For example, they play sports, they celebrate festivals. Let's say there's a Chinese New Year, right? Indian soldiers will be invited by the PLA on the other side. They'll go to the other side, celebrate the festival with the Chinese troops. Let's say it's Diwali or any other festival in India. Indian troops will invite the Chinese troops, right? We celebrate them together. This was a practice which was put in place to build bonds, to build trust, better understanding of troops at the ground level. Along with this, the agreement, it prohibits certain heavy weaponry from being deployed near the border. It clearly mentions the range within which heavy weaponry should not be present. Like, let's say ballistic missiles. You can't deploy it within 10 kilometers of the border, right? You can't have fighter jets right next to the border. Such deployment has been prohibited just to build confidence in each other. If they conduct any training exercises, if there are training exercises planned, there's a commitment on both the armies to face the other side. The exercise should be conducted facing inwards, looking at our own country, not facing the other country. All right, let's say Indian Army and Indian Air Force have planned a military exercise in Ladakh. This exercise cannot be done facing China because that might lead to a miscalculation. China might presume, which is always watching the border, China will be keeping constant surveillance. It would look at the troop mobilization and the exercises would start, and it might assume that India is attacking China. The same could happen with India. If China, let's say, plans an exercise right next to the border facing India, we might conclude that China is preparing for war, it might attack. This could lead to miscalculations. It could lead to wrong decisions and accidents. To avoid this confusion, both the sides have been mandated to face inwards while conducting exercises. Meaning Indian troops should be facing towards India. They should be a little far away from the border, right? They can't do the exercises right next to the border. Same with China. The PLA and its Air Force, they can't operate or carry out exercises right next to the border. You have to face towards China, not face India, look the other side, and even give prior notice, prior intimation as well. So such mechanisms and protocols have been put in place through these two important border agreements. It restricts the powers with regard to opening fire, deploying heavy weaponry. There are restrictions on conducting training exercises, promotes friendly confidence building measures, and establishes protocols and communication channels so that both sides can talk and de-escalate as quickly as possible. Right? That is why the border agreements are extremely important. It is very relevant because India has blamed China for breaking these commitments. In the recent clashes we have seen, the Doklam clashes of 2017, the Ladakh clashes of 2020, in both the instances, China has breached the commitments. In the recent clashes, friendly confidence building measures and establishes protocols and communication channels so that both sides can talk and de-escalate as quickly as possible. Right? That is why the border agreements are extremely important. It is very relevant because India has blamed China for breaking these commitments. In the recent clashes we have seen, the Doklam clashes of 2017, the Ladakh clashes of 2020, in both the instances, China has breached the commitments. It has violated the commitments. That is why India has reminded China of its commitments under these border agreements. It's been in news since the last 6 to 7 years. These 93, 96 agreements, they are in news since Doklam crisis. So UPSC might ask a main question here. What are these border agreements? Why are they significant? Right? You have to explain how China has breached these agreements. What are the key measures, key provisions included here, and explain that these agreements helped in repairing the relationship at least for a few years. It played an important role in stabilizing the relations. But it was briefly disrupted by the nuclear tests, as I explained earlier. For a short period, I would say from 98 to 2000. During this period, there was a disruption in the relationship because India tested nuclear weapons. Plus, we had a complex relationship going on with Pakistan during this time. We had multiple terror attacks. We had the Kargil conflict. Right? So a lot of tensions were present between India and Pakistan. So 98 to 2000 was a difficult period. Right? There was a disruption in the relationship. China even worked with US to impose sanctions on India. China criticized our nuclear program and was trying to target India as well. So obviously, for a couple of years, there was a disruption. But very quickly, this was repaired. The damage was repaired because starting from 2000, there was no way that India and China could ignore each other. They couldn't ignore each other, especially because of the economic need and the diplomatic need. Let me explain this. Both India and China now were having common concerns and common interests. For example, both were emerging as the fastest growing economies in the world. China was already ahead of India. It had already become a manufacturing hub by late 1990s. It was all a result of the economic policies of China. It established itself as a manufacturing hub, right? It had invited capital from around the world, investments from around the world. It literally became the backbone, the manufacturing backbone of the world, right? So as China became a dominant Asian economy and an Asian power, we saw the parallel rise of India, another Asian power. India's economic reforms, introduced by Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, right, was pushing India into the next phase of growth. This was taken forward by the Vajpayee government, and by 2000, India was registering phenomenal growth. So India and China became the fastest growing economies, and we saw the rise of Asian powers. Also remember, the Cold War had ended. The world was changing. Geopolitics, global economy was changing. Soviet Union had collapsed. So there was a strong economic need for India and China to collaborate, to work together, because they both needed raw materials, several important goods. They needed investments. They had to help each other. They had to work with each other. They needed markets. For India, China was a big market. For China, India was a big market. So both had common interests here. Next, there was a big diplomatic need to work together. We were having many concerns with developed countries. This was a result of the difference between developed and developing world. There were important global platforms and conventions where a clear divide had come up between developed Western countries and the developing nations. For example, at WTO, at Climate Change Convention, all right, on some matters at the UN, on all these global platforms, both the sides were developing certain common interests. Now, if you look at climate change, for example, developed countries were not accepting their historical responsibility, especially the US. It was not ready to pay for historical emissions. but it was putting the burden on India, China, the developing fast-growing economies, asking India, China to take more responsibilities. So naturally, India, China aligned together at climate change negotiations. When Kyoto Protocol was worked out in 1997, which was the first climate agreement, India, China worked very closely together. We even gave leadership to the G77 group. India, China led the G77 group, which is an informal group at the UN for promoting South-South cooperation. We became close partners to help other developing countries and small countries because we needed their support to counter the developed countries, which were targeting India and China. Similarly, at WTO, with regard to trade policies, intellectual property rights, right, competition laws, trade disputes, in all these matters, there were areas where India and China had a common objective. We were facing problems with developed countries like US and European countries, so we started working together. We would counter the Western countries, the Western institutions. We started having problems with World Bank and IMF, which were dominated by the West. So naturally, India and China worked together to counter the financial system dominated by Western countries. So all these factors brought India and China closer. They couldn't remain hostile anymore. And from 2000 onwards, we started seeing a significant improvement in the relationship. So there were many areas of cooperation that opened up: economic cooperation, global diplomatic cooperation. But of course, the conflicts, the competition was also there. This never went away. The conflict and competition was always there. But the focus became cooperation for a brief period, at least for around 8 years, 8 to 10 years. Cooperation became a priority. India and China realized they had to work together, both were developing countries. So they had common interests, common concerns. So they kept aside their conflicts and competition for a short period and they started working together. All right. So that's why it's a very unique relationship. On one hand, we have had ongoing conflicts and disputes. We have competed with each other, but parallelly, we have cooperated with each other as well. Is that clear? For example, China was increasing its presence in Indian Ocean from 2005 itself. It was counting India's influence in the Indian Ocean from 2005. And still, India and China were cooperating to counter World Bank, IMF, and the Western countries. That is the uniqueness of this relationship. That is how unique geopolitics can be. That's why I've been telling you from the first class. International relations is not a world of white and black. It's not that you always hate one country. It's not you're always a friend of one country. It's always a gray area. There's always that middle path where you have a complex relationship with any country. There will be areas where you work together. There will be areas you might be, having disputes and conflicts. There could be areas where you're targeting each other, working actively against each other. All right. That is how international relations work. So as it became a priority for both to work with each other, we started stepping up our relations. We carried out many high-profile visits. Indian leaders would visit China. Chinese leaders would come to India. Right. There were many high-profile visits. Indian officials would meet the Chinese counterparts. Frequent high-level exchanges started happening, thereby building more trust in the relationship. A lot of new military CBMs were introduced, confidence-building measures, especially at the border level. At the border level, where the troops are deployed, confidence-building measures were introduced, military exercises were planned, as I was pointing out. We started cooperating at multilateral and regional forums, at some groupings, such as the G77, WTO, the UN, and the Climate Change Convention. These were some specific platforms where we started working together. Later, we laid the foundation for an important grouping called the BRICS. BRICS was set up by India, China, along with Russia, Brazil, and later South Africa, to counter the World Bank and the IMF, to counter the Western domination of the global financial and banking system. World Bank and IMF were outdated institutions which were not reforming. So to counter the West and its domination, these countries set up the BRICS. So we were working together at multilateral and regional forums. We even exchanged maps to clarify our position, to clear the perception. We exchanged what is our perception of the border by sharing the map. China also did the same. They exchanged maps of each other, what they think should be the border. This would clarify the positions. It would clear the perception and it would help in avoiding incursions. Now let's say Chinese troops have a map which shows them what is the claim of India, what is the border line that India claims. If they know that, they can avoid carrying out an incursion, accidentally stepping into Indian territory. Similarly, India can do the same if we have Chinese maps, if we understand what is China's perception of the border. So that is why maps were exchanged. It was a positive development. It helped in avoiding incursions for some years. Then came the important visit of Prime Minister Vajpayee to China. This was another historic visit. It was during this visit that India-China cemented their relationship, and for the first time, China recognized Sikkim as an integral part of India. It recognized that Sikkim is a part of India, that laid the ground for reopening the Nathula Pass, the strategic Nathula Pass, which had been shut in 1967. During the 62 war and the 67 clashes at Nathula, the border point at Nathula Pass was closed. It wasn't open for 40 plus years. I've explained why Nathula is important. It has a lot of historical, cultural significance. It was a trade route which connected Indian civilization with Tibet and China. Buddhism has traveled to the route here. This is a route for Kailash Manasarovar Yatra for Hindu pilgrims. There has been border trade between Sikkim and Tibet since historical times. Plus, it's a strategic location where both India and China have deployed troops. Is that clear? It's next to Doklam and Chumbi Valley. It's a very, very vital location for both the sides. So Nathula Pass was shut following the war and the clashes in 1960s. It was reopened for the first time finally in 2006 because China finally recognized Sikkim as part of India, as Indian territory. All right? It remained open until 2017, until the Doklam dispute. When Doklam clashes started again, when it escalated into a standoff, which we covered under India-Bhutan, the Nathula Pass was again shut for a brief period. For another couple of years, Nathula Pass was closed until 2019. Before it could be fully reopened, the pandemic hit. Pandemic and travel restrictions came up. So again, Nathula Pass was closed. Now we are slowly reopening Nathula Pass, which is of great importance for Sikkim, for border trade, and for connectivity. During this visit, Prime Minister Vajpayee and the Chinese leader made a very big progress. That's why it's a historic visit. It's a landmark visit. They established the SR mechanism, the special representative mechanism. This was the first time a formal mechanism was created to resolve the border dispute through talks, through negotiations. They set up this special platform to find a political solution, to identify the parameters, and to guide the boundary negotiations so that we can find a negotiated settlement. I hope you can realize how important, how big this development was. Because both were acknowledging that talks are the solution. Negotiation is the solution to settle this dispute. Not war, not conflict. That showed the maturity in the relationship at that point of time. So what is this SR mechanism? Under the special representative mechanism, both countries will appoint their special representatives. India would appoint the National Security Advisor as the special representative. Prime Minister Vajpayee, right, chose the NSA, National Security Advisor. It was a newly created position. So India's NSA was appointed as India's special representative. China appointed the State Counselor. The State Council in the Communist Party plays a critical role in China's foreign and security policy. The State Councilor is like the equivalent of NSA. If India has NSA, China has the State Councilor. The roles are quite equivalent. The State Councilor advises the top leaders of the Communist Party regarding foreign and national security matters. So these two are appointed as the special representatives, as the envoys of India and China. So they would meet, they would talk to identify the political parameters and the guiding factors which would help us find a permanent political solution to resolve the boundary dispute once for all. All right, they would discuss all the political implications, discuss the priorities, the concerns of each other, identify the areas where one can compromise, identify areas which are more important to India, identify areas which are more important to China, right? And conduct technical exercises, conduct surveys on the ground eventually, and come up with maps and finalize this with a boundary agreement. So what was the purpose of the SR mechanism, the special representative mechanism? Under this mechanism, several rounds of talks took place from 2003 to 2009. There were several rounds of talks that took place. They even made some progress. The SR mechanism was seeing some limited progress. So everything was going well for the India-China relations. Things were looking good. Our economic relations had boomed by this time. There was a massive flow of Chinese goods into India. India's exports to China had gone up. All right, China was investing heavily in India. So India-China were looking at a positive, bright future ahead. They were collaborating in multiple domains. We even had a military exercise called Hand in Hand. Right, we were collaborating at global platforms. Strong economic ties were being built. Plus, we set up a mechanism to resolve the boundary dispute forever through talks. Right, so nothing could have been better than this. We even elevated our relations to the strategic level. We signed the Strategic and Cooperative Partnership Agreement, establishing strategic ties between India and China. All right, so until 2009, it looked as if everything was fine. There were issues, but it was all issues which could be handled. But all of a sudden, from 2007 to 2009, we saw a shift in China's attitude towards India. There was a sudden shift, a dramatic shift happened. There were signs of it from 2007 itself. There were signs that China is again going back to its behavior. It became very evident in 2009, and from 2010, it was very clear to India that China is back where it was. By 2009-10, China was sending confused signals to India. There were still some areas where we were cooperating, where we had at least some decent relations, but there were many concerns, many threats coming up from China. This was not by accident, it was all deliberate, and I'll explain why. We need to understand why relations broke down after this improvement. What happened to China after 2007? That is something we have to understand in detail. All right. Now, the reason why I spoke about SR mechanism is because when the Ladakh clashes happened in 2020, I'm sure you would have heard about the Galwan clashes at the Galwan River Valley, where Indian and Chinese soldiers beat up each other, they injured each other. Many were pushed down the valley as well, and many soldiers lost their lives. Around 20 Indian soldiers were martyred. Many PLA soldiers were killed as well. This was the biggest escalation India-China have seen since the 1962 war. It appeared as if in June 2020 that India-China are going to war again. That was the seriousness of the situation. So at that point, India reactivated the SR mechanism. From 2009-2010, SR mechanism had stopped. After a few rounds of talks and limited progress, due to China's changed behavior, SR talks had been suspended. But in 2020, India revived the SR mechanism for one time. It was an emergency reach out from India, from the Modi government. Right? India's NSA reached out to China's State Councilor to resolve the tensions immediately because things were looking very, very bad. It was looking very dangerous. Both were at their highest state of alert. Their nuclear forces were put on alert. Right? Both were again preparing for a possible conflict. It was quite similar to Doklam crisis, a repeat of Doklam, and that on a bigger scale, on a larger scale. At least Doklam was a disputed territory of Bhutan, right? But this was Indian territory, and there was a much bigger possibility of escalation. So at this point, when Galwan clashes had happened, both sides had lost soldiers, things were getting heated up. India reached out to China. India extended an invite to revive the SR mechanism, and China accepted it. So India's national security advisor and China's state councilor, they met, they talked, they spoke to each other, they had a virtual meeting, right? And they started the de-escalation process again. That is where the de-escalation began. From July 2020, the talks and negotiations started. The boundary level talks started taking place between the armed forces. Local military commanders, brigade level commanders, they started talking to each other to try and resolve the issue. So over the last 2 years, there are some areas where India, China have de-escalated and disengaged. But there are some points where the standoff is still continuing even today. It's been almost 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years. Even now, there are some points in Ladakh where the standoff continues. But in other places, we have de-escalated and disengaged because it was started by the SR process. Through SR mechanism, we restarted the negotiations. We went back to the protocols, the border agreements, and as per those protocols, negotiations have taken place, and we have de-escalated. We have disengaged from many places. That is why SR mechanism was in news recently. So UPSC might ask a question: what is the SR mechanism? What does it deal with? So you should know it deals with the border issue. It was an arrangement created in 2003, where special envoys were appointed, India's NSA and China's state councilor, to talk to each other to find a political solution for the border dispute. All right. So now let's see what happened after 2007. What really happened here during this period that changed China's behavior towards India? Can anyone take a guess? Can anyone tell me what could be the reason? Is there any specific reason, or is it just China's behavior? Is China just being unpredictable, as it always is? Or is there any specific reason? Xi Jinping came to power. That's not the only reason. Economic crisis, 2008 economic crisis, nuclear weapons, Quad, Taiwan issue. No, that's not the primary reason. Chitra has got it right. Chitra and Adye and few students, very few students are getting it right. The primary reason was the growing proximity between India and US. By 2004, India-US relations had been repaired. Remember, under India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, I explained what happened after 9/11 attacks. After 9/11 attacks, US started looking at India as a partner in counterterrorism. As US couldn't trust Pakistan entirely, it needed India's help to counter terrorism in Pakistan and Afghanistan. We started working closely in the field of intelligence. We started sharing intelligence. We started building close defense military relations as well. And very quickly, India-US became strategic defense and military partners. We signed the civil nuclear deal. We signed a close defense partnership agreement, and US started supplying weapons to India. We expanded the military exercises between India and US. And more importantly, in the year 2009, after building close strategic and military relations, the United States announced a new policy called Pivot to Asia policy. The then US President Barack Obama came out with a new foreign policy doctrine. The US announced a pivot to Asia. It means the US was shifting its focus. It was recalibrating its diplomatic and military approach. It was moving away from the Atlantic West Asia focus. This was the obsession of the US. This was the American obsession. For several decades, US had deployed all its diplomatic military resources centered around the Atlantic and West Asia. This was the priority of US for many, many decades. Now this was shifting because of the aggressive rise of China. As China and US entered the Cold War, as a rivalry began between them from 2000 onwards, the US recalibrated its approach and shifted its diplomatic and military priorities. This happened under the Pivot to Asia policy of the US, which continues even today. And under the Pivot to Asia policy, US saw India as a critical partner, as an important strategic military partner, which could counterbalance China. This is how US saw India. India had no such intentions. Even today, we have no intention of being a proxy of the US. We have no intention to counterbalance China. But US came up with this approach. This was an American belief that India could be set up as a counter to China. If US gives India the right support, the right weapons, US assumed that India would become a proxy of the US, an ally of the US, and India could be used to target China and counter China. Because see, India was a large democracy, a vibrant democracy with a strong economy. Right? According to US, India is a right counter to China. It could help balance the power equations in Indo-Pacific. But India never had any such vision. Even today, we are not American allies. We are not allies of anyone. We have our own policy to follow. We have our own interests with China as well. We are not here to serve American interests. Right? We are not a proxy of the US to counter China. More importantly, we have borders with China. We can't take the risk as well to unnecessarily enter this game where US plays India against China. Even though India was very clear on this, there were some signals which led China to assume that India has become a Western ally. India has become very close to US. Both are working together to counter and contain China. This was the perception that came up. This is the primary trigger, the primary reason which led China to break the friendly relations that was developing. First, it started sending out some mixed signals. It continued the friendly ties, but it would create problems, put some pressure on India to send a message. But after 2020, after 2017 itself, China has broken all the niceties. It has become completely aggressive and hostile to India. This change is mainly because of the growing India-US relations. All right. For example, in 2009, we approached Asian Development Bank for loans for a project in Arunachal Pradesh. For the first time, China did not object. Previously, if India had asked for a loan from ADB for a project in Arunachal Pradesh, China, which is the most important member of ADB, would have rejected the funding. China has the highest voting share at Asian Development Bank. All right, it's a development bank, provides financial assistance, just like World Bank. All right, it's headquartered in Philippines, in Manila. So China, Japan, and India are the top shareholders at this bank. But China is the biggest shareholder, biggest voting share China has. So it would use its voting share and influence to block any funding to Indian projects in Arunachal Pradesh. Because China was claiming it was Chinese territory. It was South Tibet. This was before. But because of the improved relations, we saw that China did not object. On one hand, it appeared that China was becoming close to India. It was no longer objecting to projects in Arunachal. It was allowing the funding to happen. But parallelly, it created problems as well. In 2007, India elevated the Malabar naval exercise. The Malabar naval exercise was started in 1990s, specifically 1992. It was just a bilateral exercise between India and US. All right. After the Cold War ended, there was outreach from US to India to improve military relations. So a bilateral naval exercise had been started called Malabar Naval Exercise, which was between Indian Navy and the American Navy. This exercise was going on for many years. All right. It was happening every year. This was not the main problem for China. But in 2007, India elevated the exercise. We expanded the exercise, and along with US, we invited other like-minded powers, Japan, Australia, and Singapore. India brought several like-minded democracies together and conducted one of the biggest military exercises, the Malabar Naval Exercise in the Bay of Bengal. Now, this was seen as a threat by China. China saw this as an attempt by India and US to create a military bloc, to create a military club, to target China, to contain China, especially near Malacca Strait, to contain China's growth, to exert military pressure on China. So China started assuming all of this when we hosted the biggest ever Malabar exercise. This was in 2007. Following this, China retaliated. It criticized India, put pressure on India. India got the message, right? India had no intention to form a military club. That was not our purpose. But we decided not to antagonize China because we just had started friendly relations. We didn't want to upset China unnecessarily. We wanted a friendly neighbor. Keeping this interest in mind, India returned Malabar to bilateral format. We suspended the multilateral exercise, made it a bilateral exercise again. We stopped inviting Japan, Australia, and others. We brought it back to just an exercise between India and US. All right, this was one signal from China that it was not happy with India, US forming these alliances with others. There were other developments like these. In 2009, there would be Indian athletes and Indian military officials who would apply for a Chinese visa. Okay, few Indian athletes and few military officers of India, they would be looking to travel to China because there would be a sporting event, right? Or there would be a military exercise. So they would apply for Chinese visas. And if these athletes and military officers, if they were from, let's say, Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir, or if they were from Arunachal Pradesh, China would deliberately not issue a visa to them. Right? When they would apply at the Chinese embassy in Delhi, the embassy would send their passports back with a stapled paper, with a stapled visa. Instead of giving a regular visa as it is given to foreign citizens, China attached a paper slip was attached to the passport. It's called a stapled visa. And this was given to Indian athletes and Indian officials from Ladakh, J&K, and Arunachal Pradesh. This was a message, a symbolic message. What does it mean? It means China is telling the people of Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh that they don't need a visa to visit their own country. Since these are disputed areas claimed by China, China didn't give them a visa. Is that clear? China was sending a message that these territories don't belong to India. It is Chinese territory. Why are you applying for a visa? You don't need a visa. You're our own citizens, please come. We are giving you a stapled visa. This was a deliberate attempt to trigger India, to send a message to India that China will retaliate if India gets closer to Western countries. This was a direct question on India's sovereignty. It went on for several months. For several months, Chinese embassy kept issuing stapled visas when people from Ladakh and Arunachal applied for Chinese visas. Later, when we approached ADB for loans, China would block the loan. We saw the same happening at the UN. Whenever India was trying to target Pakistan, especially after Mumbai attacks, China was shielding Pakistan, protecting Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism. So it became clear that China was now turning hostile again. By this point, China had become our largest trading partner. Today, China is the biggest trade partner of India. You might have read news reports that our trade volume has crossed $100 billion. There is a huge trade deficit. We have a huge economic relationship with China. There's a lot of dependency that India has on China. All right, we'll study that more in the next part of my discussion. We'll come to economic relations. So while our economic relations were booming, parallelly, tensions also started escalating. China started showing more aggression against India day by day. Fresh incursions broke out in Ladakh and in few other places. In 2013 and 2014, there were a series of incursions. These were not accidental, they were deliberate. See, when relations were genuinely improving from 1990s to 2009, we didn't have any major incursion. Incursions deliberately started happening after 2009, which was clearly a signal that China was sending a message to India. It was putting pressure on India, targeting India, ordering India not to work with US and other countries. All right, because for China right now, the biggest rival is the US. A cold war has already begun, it's going on between them. There's intense rivalry between them. These are the two global powers today. And China cannot afford its neighbor India to be aligned with its rival. Right? So for India, this position is not suitable. We can't take such bullying, such aggressive, exploitative methods. India cannot take this lying down. That is why India also has retaliated. India has taken its own steps to counter the Chinese aggression. So as a result, the relations have broken down in the recent years. We made one more attempt. We signed another border defense cooperation agreement in 2013. This was the third border agreement that was signed, which would provide for cooperation between the defense forces at the border area. The intention was again to calm the tensions down, to clarify the positions, to prevent these incursions from happening. So we did sign a border agreement, the third border agreement, the BDCA, Border Defense Cooperation Agreement. But this didn't have any impact. It fell apart immediately. China never really followed these commitments. And we saw the biggest escalation in 2017 when it opened the Doklam crisis in Bhutan. China started building the road, which was objected to by India. It led to a military standoff and clashes, which very quickly escalated. Right? We studied the Doklam crisis in detail under India-Bhutan. So as the tensions went up, the message was very clear to India by now. For some time, India was also confused. Sometimes we were thinking, okay, China, it might be just doing a mistake. Or sometimes we thought it could be just accidental. Because there were areas where we were still collaborating. There were areas where China was still friendly. But parallelly, these incidents kept happening one by one. And after the Doklam crisis, it became clear to India that China is an aggressive power. It will be an aggressive power. And it will have issues with India. This is something we have to continue dealing with for mostly the whole of this century. This century would be the defining century for India and China, right? As they rise to global dominance. China is already a global power. India is on the way. So as we emerge as global powers, there will be either conflict and competition or cooperation. Or maybe a mix of both again, you never know. But as of now, we are in such a phase where China is hostile to India. Especially after Xi Jinping became the leader, after he was elected as General Secretary in 2012. Since then, Xi Jinping has led a very aggressive policy, not just against India, against every country. Xi Jinping is seen as a revisionist leader. He has been compared with Mao Zedong and other authoritarian leaders of China. He's the only Chinese leader who has been compared with Mao Zedong himself. So Xi Jinping has cemented his position, emerged